Someone's unknown hand knocked hard on the door, breaking the silence of the night with a booming echo, causing the walls to tremble from the sharp sound, as if the darkness itself demanded an answer, hiding something sinister behind it that did not want to remain in the darkness and sought to penetrate inside. The man, tightly clutching the icy, weakened hand of his exhausted friend, desperately cried out into the night emptiness for help, knocked on doors, and begged to be let in. But there was a frightening silence all around, and no one seemed to be going to answer his pleas. With a heavy heart and a feeling of oppressive emptiness, he turned and slowly walked away, realizing that in this city frozen in the night, silence, there was no other living soul except himself. A lonely traveler among dark shadows and cold stone. The woman clenched her teeth in irritation, feeling anger and pain rise up in her chest again, because 3 long months had already passed since that very day that changed her life. And the dark bandage hiding her disfigured face now became a reminder that the past could not be returned. She was a stunning blonde with a perfectly toned figure, and her large expressive eyes flashed with anger as she jerked her head up and asked in irritation what kind of madman had dared to disturb her peace this time, breaking the silence of the night. The thick, massive book lying before her was an old novel, written with grace and depth, and yet in life, such absurdities often happened that sometimes it seemed as if someone invisible was playing with fate, changing its direction in the most unexpected way. The pages of the book, one after another, softly flew down, smoothly circling in the air, and the main character, as if obeying an inexplicable law, suddenly felt her consciousness dissolving, and then completely transferred into this mysterious, enchanting world. She quickly got used to the new world, because from childhood, when she was a little happy girl from a noble family, her imagination allowed her to easily fit into the most unusual stories, as if reality for her always remained only one of the possible ones. Here she grew up, turning into a noble lady, whose confident look spoke of strength and determination, and her image in an impeccable white shirt, strict trousers, and a long cloak, fluttering in the wind, made her look like a heroine who knew what she wanted from life. The boys sat right next to the closed door, staring into the gloomy darkness, hoping that someone would hear them and let them in, while one of them tried to stay on his feet, and the other, exhausted, lay unconscious on the cold floor, like a shadow of himself. With irritation, the beauty realized that these unexpected guests did not even think of leaving, as if their feet were rooted to the ground in front of her threshold. And now she had to decide whether to drive them away completely or still let them inside, contrary to the voice of reason. The man standing next to her cast an attentive glance at the lady and asked with a slight mockery if she had really been on a business trip again, to which her partner nodded reservedly in agreement, as if it was something so familiar that it was not worth any extra words. Frowning and closing her eyes, the girl sighed wearily, answering that this man was already the 6th in her list of orders, although she did not at all take on the role of a savior and did not intend to turn her home into a hospital ward for the suffering. It all started 2 years ago, when one ordinary day, without a shadow of a doubt, she extended a helping hand to a stranger who suddenly collapsed at her feet, and, obeying an incomprehensible inner impulse, she healed him, not even realizing that this act would change her life forever. From that very day, as if led by an unknown force, people began to flock to her house, falling to their knees or even falling exhausted right in front of her door, with a pleading look in their eyes, expecting a new miracle from her, as if fate itself had placed on her the duty of saving everyone who crossed her threshold. Syrinx. That was the name of this beautiful but clearly irritated girl, thought angrily that in fact she was a jeweler by profession, not a healer, and her skilled hands were meant for working with precious stones, not for saving strangers. She lived in the western part of the country, in a city divided into 5 large districts, and her own was far from the safest. There were enough criminals, abandoned houses, and dubious deals in which honesty was an empty phrase. Syrinx herself lived a double life, balancing between danger and art, because, despite her rare talent, she remained a shadow in the world of jewelers, working illegally, creating truly exquisite jewelry from precious stones that fell into her hands in various ways. Gasping and theatrically waving his hand in front of himself, the man asked his interlocutor, with curiosity and slight mockery, why she didn't change her profession and become a full-fledged healer, because in that case, she could earn much more money than on her jewelry. Syrinx raised an eyebrow in displeasure, then retorted with irritation, stating that she did not have an official license, and if the authorities found out about her illegal abilities, they would not hesitate to send her to death, as had happened to many before her. In this world, there was a mysterious spiritual power that was only available to a select few, and those who possessed this gift were called healers, wielding a rare and powerful magic known as the Great Golden Power, a shining light in the middle of endless darkness. All those who possessed the gift of spiritual power were subject to mandatory registration in the temple, where they passed tests, received a license, and became priests, bound by an oath of service, because the use of magic without permission was considered a serious crime. The country's coat of arms depicted two proud deer rearing up on either side of a massive shield with a majestic castle on it, symbolizing the strength and steadfastness of an empire in which the law was unbending and violators faced harsh punishment. If anyone dared to go against the established rules, he would immediately be hunted by the legendary hound of the empire, the ruthless Marquis Fortessi, a man whose name inspired fear even among the most desperate criminals. Syrinx, with unwavering confidence and a stern expression on her face, declared that she would never become a healer because her soul belonged to the art of jewelry, and she intended to devote her entire life to it, without turning away from her chosen path, despite any persuasion or arguments. Her friend just silently spread his hands, making it clear that he was not going to argue with her, because he knew very well her stubbornness and strength of character, which did not allow her to change her mind, especially when it came to her true calling and devotion to her favorite cause. After a short pause, he slightly bowed his head, and with a barely noticeable movement, pointed his finger toward the people who were sitting near her house, needing help, as if hinting that, despite her words, she still could not pass by someone else's suffering, because compassion was hidden in her heart. Suddenly, the man burst into loud, enthusiastic cries, praising her as a wise, strong, and talented sorceress, and the woman immediately raised her hand, demanding silence, not wanting to attract unnecessary attention to herself, which could turn into trouble for them. The young man, who had been sitting calmly by her large door until then, suddenly shuddered upon hearing a loud cry, and, slightly frowning, turned in their direction in surprise, clearly not expecting such a violent display of emotions, and not understanding what exactly could have caused such a reaction. The girl stopped abruptly, cast a quick glance back, and, turning on her heels, walked away, saying as she went that she had completely forgotten how many urgent matters she had, hoping that such an argument would make everyone leave her alone and stop pressuring her. Syrinx tried to force a polite smile onto her face, but an expression of irritation still broke through. She frowned, mentally cursing her hapless friend for dragging her into conversation again, while an unfamiliar young man ran towards her with a desperate expression on his face. Stopping right in front of her, he breathed heavily, as if he had been running for a long time without stopping, and then, taking a small step forward, with difficulty, his breath intermittent, he asked if this house really belonged to her, as if something extremely important depended on her answer. Pressing his palm to his chest in an attempt to catch his breath, he straightened up a little, looked her straight in the eyes, and, introducing himself as No Name, with a sincere plea in his voice, declared that he was begging her for help, as if only she could save those who needed her gift. After these words, the young man abruptly waved his hand, pointing toward his friend, who was lying unconscious on the cold ground, looking as if he was on the verge of life and death. His face was pale, and his breathing was barely noticeable, as if any delay could be fatal for him. Before Syrinx could even recover, No Name turned and hurried away, shouting loudly over his shoulder that he was leaving his friend in her care, as if it were a settled fact that she would have to accept whether she wanted to or not. Only a moment passed, and he dissolved into the darkness of the night, as if he had never existed, and the only thing that reminded of his presence was the silent, empty passage between the buildings, over which reigned silence, oppressive and deaf, as if the city itself held its breath. Syrinx raised her head in irritation and anger, clenched her fists, and shouted furiously that her home was neither a refuge nor a place for other people's worries. But even despite this, there was still something more than anger in her gaze, a shadow of doubt that melted into the cold night air. Frustrated and lost in dark thoughts, Syrinx slowly walked towards her house, her posture betraying fatigue. Her shoulders were drooping, and behind her back hung a bag, which she casually held with her hand, as if this weight was pressing not only on her body, but also on her soul, making her steps even heavier. On the ground, lying motionless in the dim light of the night, was a stranger, his breathing barely noticeable, and on his chest there was a dark scarlet mark, a deep wound from which blood oozed, soaking the fabric of his clothes and leaving ominous stains on his pale skin. Syrinx looked down at the unfortunate man. Irritation flashed in her eyes, her lips pressed into a thin line. And even without words, it was clear that discontent was boiling in her soul. Why should she be the one to solve this problem that was so obsessively thrown at her? But sighing and closing her eyes for a moment, she nevertheless sank to her knees in front of the unexpected guest, mentally cursing her inability to leave someone in trouble, and already feverishly thinking about how to drag this unfortunate man home before he finally lost his last strength. She nudged the lamp slightly, and its dim light broke the darkness, pouring a soft glow over the surrounding space. And when she turned her head to the side, she realized with painful clarity that her friend had also left, leaving her alone with this strange man. Syrinx staggered back in complete shock as realization hit her mind like a chilling wave of shock, and before her lay someone she had never expected to see in such a state. And her mind, like a broken clock, froze as it tried to process what it had seen. Her large violet eyes, usually full of brilliance, were now frozen in an expression of profound shock. Her lips were parted, but not for words, only for silent disbelief, and the whole world seemed to narrow down to a single moment where emotions and reason desperately argued over what to consider truth. It was the magnificent Heimdall, a youth with dazzlingly blonde hair, whose shirt was stained with blood, and whose refined features, despite the wounds, retained an aristocratic beauty, as if he had stepped out of the pages of an ancient legend filled with tragedy and loss. He was the hero of the book, one of the central characters, the son of a great conqueror, who was promised a brilliant destiny from birth. But in one fateful moment, he lost everything that was dear to him. And now his past has turned into shadows that haunt him even through pain and time. Heimdall lay blinking occasionally, his scarlet eyes, as if captured by the flames of battle, gleaming dully in the semi-darkness, and from the corner of his lips flowed a thin stream of blood mixed with his breathing, which was becoming heavier and heavier, as if he was on the verge of awakening, of complete oblivion. The young man, as if awakening from a long, heavy sleep, slowly parted his lips, but his voice was too weak, barely perceptible, and it seemed that each word was given to him with unbearable difficulty. Lost somewhere between reality and the shadow of forgotten dreams, the girl, overcome with anxiety, carefully leaned closer, straining her ears, trying to make out what her mysterious companion was whispering, whose breathing and voice merged with the surrounding silence, as if he was trying to say something important. But the words slipped away, dissolving in the night air. Suddenly, his hand trembled, as if obeying a final surge of will, and with a sharp but weakened movement, he reached out to her, trying to grab her wrist, but instead of the warmth of someone else's skin, his fingers closed on emptiness, meeting only the cold touch of inexorable fate. Without thinking, Syrinx instinctively recoiled back, fear piercing her body, and as she took a sharp step, she felt the heel of the boot press painfully into the boy's toes, causing him to flinch, and she herself instantly became even more frightened when she realized what she had done. The night sky stretched above them, shrouded in thick, velvety darkness, and only the silent moon, lonely and cold, illuminated the world with a ghostly light, in which distant, unattainable stars shone silver, watching their destinies with indifferent grandeur. Heimdall smiled suddenly, as if gathering his last bits of strength. His eyes narrowed lazily, and a shadow of contentment, or perhaps doomed resignation, appeared on his lips. And at that moment, under the cold light of the moon, he looked almost unearthly, beautiful. He made no attempt to free his hand from under the girl's heel, showed no anger or pain, but merely lay motionless, silent, as if this world no longer had power over him, as if he were just a dream that would soon fade away, leaving behind only vague memories and a slight sadness. This novel always seemed unusual, different from the usual stories, because it had two main characters, two opposites, one with golden hair, the embodiment of a clear dawn, the other with strands dyed in the shade of evening roses, and their characters, so different, collided. The first part of the novel told the story of a blonde, her difficult path and her harem, where she was surrounded by devoted and loving men. But fate turned out to be cruel to her, and at the very end, when it seemed that happiness could be ahead, she got into a deadly predicament from which there was no way out. In the second part, the story focused on her younger sister, a girl with pink hair who, despite her outward cheerfulness, could not forget the loss and, deep down, suffered from loneliness, filling the void with relationships with different men. Heimdall was the only man, dangerous and unpredictable, who never succumbed to the charm of the second main heroine, remaining faithful only to the first, the one who was already resting in the ground, and his heart, filled with devotion and sorrow, did not allow him to even think about another woman. On the contrary, the young man felt a chilling hatred toward the pink-haired girl, despised her for being alive, for her smiles, for the very fact of her existence, and in his soul burned only one desire: to see how she would follow her sister, disappearing from this world forever. The main character's parents once committed a terrible act, kidnapping two young brothers from their family, and from that moment the boy's fate was sealed, because they were destined to go through pain, loss, and endless trials that no one who grew up in warmth and prosperity knew about. On that fateful day, his brother, clinging to life with all his might, stretched out his trembling hand to the young aristocrat, as if hoping for a miracle, for salvation. But this miracle did not happen, and instead of help, cold death came, mercilessly tearing him from this world, leaving behind only blood. In the end, Heimdall was left completely alone. His twin was no more, and with this realization, a void settled in his heart, filling every part of his mind, and the pain of loss shrank into an icy lump that he could no longer melt with tears or desperate pleas. After his brother's death, the boy found himself in a place where lost souls might go. He was captured and taken to the black market, where people were traded like things, and soon his fate was decided against his will when someone, with a cold and appraising look, named a price and bought him. Heimdall was broken not only by pain and loss, but by fate itself, which stained his hands with blood and forced him to step onto the path of evil, where there was no forgiveness, no light, but only endless darkness, poisoning the mind and soul, until nothing remained but rage and a thirst for retribution. Over the years, his hatred only grew stronger, and as he grew older, he wanted only one thing: to take revenge on the main character, the one whose parents had once kidnapped him and his brother, turned them into goods, deprived them of their childhood and hope, and now he was ready to return to them all the horror that he himself had to endure. The man, ruthless and cruel, became the greatest villain, the one who could not be redeemed or saved, the main antagonist of this story, tormenting the second heroine of the novel, exhausting her not only physically but also mentally, destroying her world step by step, like a doomed ghost of someone else's revenge. And now, this same Heimdall, once proud and dangerous, lay on the ground, bleeding, and his lips curved into a strange, sly smile, as if even now, being on the brink of death, he continued to mock fate, as if he saw something funny in it that was incomprehensible to others. The young man could no longer resist the fatigue. His body gave in, and his mind sank into darkness, while the lady who stood next to him was finally able to catch her breath, watching as her greatest enemy fell silent, and the cold night spread out around them, silent and indifferent. Syrinx tried to catch her breath, her heart pounding, and fear still gripping her body, making her glance around nervously, as if there might be greater threats lurking in the dark night than the bleeding boy at her feet. She looked thoughtfully at his face, amazed at how handsome he was, but there was something disturbing about his appearance, as if behind this perfection there was hidden an abyss of pain and suffering. And the man who had once left him on her doorstep was not just a random passerby. These lands were ruled by 5 feudal lords, 5 shadows, whose gaze seemed to see through the darkness itself, silently observing every movement, every event, and their influence spread everywhere, penetrating the destinies of people, even if they were not aware of it. Looking down, she found herself thinking that the boy's mentor, whoever he was certainly one of these powerful rulers. And if so, then before her lay a man whose life was intertwined with intrigue, danger, and most likely, countless crimes. The soft blanket slid down silently, covering the young man so that his weakened body would not freeze in the cold night, because no matter who he was and what he did, he was still a living being, desperately clinging to an elusive life. Syrinx, without turning around, headed home, throwing a barely audible promise to the unconscious handsome guy that she would definitely return in the morning, check on his condition, and only then provide the necessary first aid, if, of course, he survived until dawn. The bright sun was already rising over the city, its first rays breaking through the spreading crowns of trees, illuminating the streets and giving everything around a warm golden glow, as if nature itself was trying to erase the traces of the past night and start a new day with a clean slate. Syrinx and his friend stood at the entrance, breathing heavily from fatigue and the shock they had experienced. Their gazes were tense, and their hearts were still squeezed with anxiety, as if something invisible continued to press on them, not allowing them to relax even for a moment. The handsome man lay motionless on the bed. His face was pale, his breathing was weak, and on his chest there was a wide bleeding cut that, despite all efforts, was in no hurry to heal, leaving the feeling that fate itself had not yet decided whether to let him live or take him with it into the unknown. Syrinx trudged wearily next to her friend, sighing heavily every now and then, and complaining about how heavy the man was, as if the whole world had suddenly fallen on her shoulders as she dragged him through the darkness of the night, trying with all her might to keep her balance so as not to collapse to the ground herself. Sitting down on an old creaky chair next to the bed where their mysterious patient lay motionless, she slowly gathered her unruly hair into a high ponytail, thoughtfully watching his pale, lifeless face, as if trying to guess whether he would wake up or remain in silence. Bowing her head and allowing the disturbing thoughts to take over her consciousness for a moment, the girl suddenly realized that the man's breathing, although weak, was even, which meant that, despite her fears, he was still alive, albeit balancing somewhere on the thinnest line between light and endless darkness. Her friend's warm fingers confidently squeezed the fragrant sandwich, in which soft fresh bread was intertwined with juicy vegetables, spicy spices, and stretchy cheese, awakening hunger even in those who a minute ago did not think about food at all. forcing them to feel the taste of life. With a slight smile, the lady's friend, teasing her, suggested that she could very well marry her clients, since there were wealthy people among them, to which the lady, with an ironic gleam in her eyes, objected that, unfortunately, or fortunately, all the patients had previously turned out to be women. Smiling wider, Syrinx began to list her previous guests who had been under her caring hand. A wily villain, a daring thief, an aristocrat drowning in debt, and many other individuals whose destinies, one way or another, intersected with her own. Having finished her peculiar story, the girl, without hiding her joy, turned to her friend, noting with slight mockery that, to her great regret, all these noble ladies, despite their eccentricity, invariably showed interest exclusively in men. Her friend, realizing that such conversations could backfire on them, grabbed his neck in mock horror, after which he nodded, agreeing that it was better to keep such confessions to themselves, because otherwise they could easily have their heads cut off for speaking too freely. Clenching his fist in front of him and winking slyly, her friend remarked with a playful grin that she finally had a male patient, and since fate had decreed it that way, why shouldn't she take advantage of this chance and take him as her husband, since such meetings don't just happen. When she was called out again, distracted from her work, Syrinx raised her head with slight irritation, sighed heavily, and asked what else they wanted from her, because hardly a little time had passed since the last intervention, and she had already managed to get tired of the constant distractions. Her friend, without losing his cheerful mood, headed for the exit, smoothly closing the door behind him. But before leaving completely, he turned around and warned her to be careful, because, despite all her courage, she was still a girl, and the one who had just arrived was a young man. Syrinx smiled warmly, tilting her head slightly, and thanked her friend with sincere gratitude for his concern, realizing that behind his jokes there was real concern. And even if he did not always speak seriously, his attention and concern were truly dear to her. The noble woman suddenly froze, deep in thought, her hands at her sides and her thoughtful gaze directed to the side, as if trying to weigh all the possible consequences of her next step, realizing that every wrong move could lead to unpredictable results. Her thoughts revolved around one important problem. In order to properly examine and treat the young man, it was necessary to remove his clothes, but there was a danger in this. If he suddenly woke up and, frightened by her touch, decided that she was an enemy, he could very well stab her with a knife. The lady was drawn to the fact that her patient suddenly began to cough. His breathing became heavy and intermittent, as if he was struggling with an invisible barrier, and Syrinx froze warily, trying to understand whether he was finally coming to his senses or whether this was just another attack of weakness. The young man slowly reached for his glasses, placed them on the bridge of his nose with trembling fingers, then, staggering, he rose with effort and sat up on the bed, still looking weakened, but clearly trying to come to his senses and figure out what was happening. His blue eyes were frozen in confusion, his gaze darting around the room, as if he was seeing her for the first time, and his face was filled with confusion, as if the memory had slipped from his mind, leaving only emptiness. And, frowning, he finally asked quietly and haltingly who it was that had saved him. Realizing that she had to be polite in this situation, Syrinx said in a calm, even voice that she had found him last night, pulled him out of danger, tended to his wounds, and helped him recover, although there was still a look of doubt on his face. Suddenly, a strong male hand unexpectedly squeezed the girl's shoulder, and Syrinx shuddered in surprise. Her heart began to beat faster, and her eyes reflected surprise mixed with tension, because she did not understand at all what he wanted from her and why he suddenly grabbed her so abruptly. The young man shouted worriedly, asking if she had done something terrible to him earlier. There was tension in his voice, and fear and excitement flashed in his eyes, as if he was trying to remember something important. but could not sort out his thoughts, and this uncertainty frightened him more than the pain in his body. Raising her hands in front of her in a placating gesture, Syrinx calmly replied that no, she had not harmed him in any way, but perhaps she had been rude in leaving him outside, as she simply could not carry him to safety. So she had been forced to leave, hoping that he would hold out until morning. Hearing her words and realizing that he himself had hurt her by squeezing her shoulder so hard, the young man immediately stepped back, looking down in embarrassment, and Syrinx, noticing his confusion, smiled understandingly, making it clear that she did not hold a grudge, because confusion could have made him do it so abruptly. Heimdall clasped his hands tightly in his lap, sighed heavily, and admitted to himself with difficulty that he still had not fully come to his senses. His consciousness remained clouded, and disturbing thoughts did not give him peace, as if something inside him was still fighting for control. After a short silence, the aristocrat, slightly embarrassed, quietly asked for forgiveness, explaining that at night something strange sometimes happens to him, as if he becomes a completely different person, losing control of himself, and then thoughts or actions can overcome him. The lady, as if not attaching much importance to his words, calmly asked the bespectacled man whether she should continue his treatment, because if he wanted to get back on his feet and recover as quickly as possible, then he shouldn't neglect medical help, especially in his current condition. She slowly pointed her finger at the wound on his chest and, slightly bowing her head, explained that if it was left unattended, not treated and bandaged properly, then infection would only be a matter of time, and the consequences could be much more severe than simple pain. With a slight smile that simultaneously conveyed concern and a barely noticeable mockery, the beauty calmly but confidently ordered her companion to remove the clothing on the upper part of his body so that she could more thoroughly examine the wound and treat the damaged tissue. Blushing with embarrassment, Heimdall awkwardly looked away, as if he hoped that he could hide his obvious confusion. But it was not only his flushed cheeks that gave him away, but also the tension in every movement, as if he was desperately struggling with his own thoughts. The man's fingers, slowly, almost hesitantly, reached for the buttons of his shirt. One after another they were unbuttoned with caution, as if the process itself was something forbidden to him, and the fabric gradually moved apart, revealing a toned body on which traces of wounds were clearly visible. The lady, however, remaining unperturbed, could not help but note to herself that there really was a real handsome man standing in front of her, and even though she was a doctor and had to concentrate on treatment, her gaze naturally lingered on his fit figure, and somewhere in her soul, she liked his body. From time to time, the man would steal cautious glances at her, in which there was a hint of shyness, as if he was trying to guess what was on her mind and check if she was laughing at his awkwardness. But seeing that her face remained calm and serious, he relaxed only slightly. They didn't call him two-faced for nothing, because as soon as night fell on the city, he turned into a merciless monster, knowing neither pity nor mercy. And during the day, as if by magic, he transformed into a calm and reasonable person, who was difficult to suspect of cruelty. At first glance, he seemed harmless and even resembled an innocent dandelion in glasses, refined, intelligent, and modest. But behind this appearance hid an essence that not everyone would dare to see, especially when night fell on the city, awakening something sinister in it. The girl tried to stay away from him, knowing full well that his dark, frightening essence awakens precisely at night, when reason retreats, giving way to unbridled rage, capable of destroying everything around without the slightest shadow of regret, and no one could stop it. Syrinx, the corners of her lips lifting in a mysterious smile, cautiously approached, trying to get a better look at him, because perhaps the moment had finally come when she would be able to examine his wounds and understand the price he was paying for his dual nature. Leaning forward a little, the girl, holding her breath, began to carefully examine the bandages that hid the traces of battles on his body. Trying to figure out what battles he had to endure, And what fear was hidden behind these carefully bandaged wounds that kept his pain within them? Suddenly, the handsome man suddenly spoke up and asked with slight excitement whether the healer was sitting too close to him, because her presence gave him a strange feeling, as if the boundaries of what was permitted had been erased, leaving only an incomprehensible confusion. He flushed like a hot coal, confusion spreading across his face in a hot flush, and his scarlet cheeks betrayed his internal struggle. His voice trembled, the words tangled, with difficulty escaping from his lips, and he could hardly concentrate, desperately trying to cope with the surging feelings. Syrinx looked up at him in surprise, thought for a moment, and then, as if nothing unusual had happened, calmly replied that such a distance between the patient and the doctor was completely normal and should not bother him, because it was just part of her job. In response, the nobleman, without getting out of bed, quietly asked for forgiveness, trying not to meet her gaze because unacceptable thoughts flashed through his head, from which he felt embarrassed, almost ashamed of his own nature, divided into two contradictory forms. The man in the novel was described as such. During the day, he was a shy, reserved young man who constantly hid his body under clothes and avoided unnecessary attention, as if he was afraid to show the world his true essence, which concealed something more than just shyness. This beauty, the duality of his nature, during the day he looked almost like a monk, and at night he turned into a dangerous beast, driven by instincts. This is what attracted readers, forcing them to follow his transformations with bated breath and guess who he really was. The beauty smiled understandingly. Her gaze slid over her interlocutor's face with slight warmth, and then, as if catching something important in his behavior, she gently bowed her head and calmly said that she had long wanted to ask him one question that had been bothering her for a long time. Heimdall, a little confused and frowning, asked in confusion what exactly the healer wanted to know from him, to which she, with an unperturbed expression on her face and a slight smile, replied that she simply wanted to touch him, examine him, to make sure of his state of health. From such an ambiguous phrase, the sweet young man instantly flushed, a blush filled his cheeks, and embarrassment took hold of him so much that he could hardly find words, feeling how his heart began to beat faster from awkwardness, and his breathing became intermittent and heavy. The lady, noticing his violent reaction, calmly, and with a slight laugh, began to explain that her gift allows her to heal people with a simple touch, and for a full treatment, she really needed to touch his body. Otherwise, she would not have been able to correctly assess his condition. Covering his face with his hands, Heimdall exhaled heavily, feeling even more awkward, and then, finally gathering his courage and slightly stumbling, muttered an inarticulate apology, adding that he had almost no experience communicating with girls, and such situations always turned out to be extremely difficult for him. A mysterious magic crystal shimmered in her slender fingers, which she had carefully hidden until now, as if she was afraid that someone would find out about its existence or understand its true power, because perhaps this artifact played a much more important role than one could assume. The young man froze awkwardly, his shoulders tensing, as he heard her calm words about how he would have to endure it for a little while, as the procedure might not be the most pleasant and might even cause some pain, the mere thought of which made him feel a slight shudder. With a slight, barely noticeable smile, the beauty, tilting her head to the side, thoughtfully said that she had already managed to notice that the guy had a rather sensitive, if not whiny, character, and he seemed to endure any unpleasant sensations with great difficulty. Heimdall, embarrassed, suddenly covered his face with his hand, trying to hide from her penetrating gaze, and then, barely audibly, but with an obvious plea in his voice, he muttered and almost stuttered, asking his companion not to laugh at him, since for him this moment was already incredibly awkward. Syrinx slowly extended her graceful hands towards the young man, narrowing her eyes in concentration, and prepared to use her power, feeling how magic began to awaken within her, filling the air around her with thin golden sparks, as if heralding the beginning of a great miracle. The lady sighed heavily, realizing how much work she had to do, because the work was complex and painstaking. The snow-white skin of her hands seemed almost transparent in the light of the magical glow, and her scarlet lips were tightly pressed together, reflecting concentration and determination. And so, without wasting a second, she began to heal the young nobleman. Golden magic flowed softly from the woman's palms, enveloping him in a warm light, similar to the sun's radiance, penetrating every cell of his body, filling him with vitality. The young man began to glow from within, as if he was turning into a living embodiment of pure magic, and his body was filled with a warm, soft glow. The wounds gradually disappeared, the skin became smooth and unharmed, and a feeling of peace, lightness, and inexplicable bliss spread throughout his body. Syrinx exhaled heavily, feeling her strength leaving her after such a powerful spell. Having completed her magic and healing, she closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to rest, and then looked tiredly, but with satisfaction, at the healed youth. When asked if she was a real healer, the young Syrinx did not hesitate to answer that she practiced the art illegally, secretly healing people who could not afford official help or were afraid to go to the huge temple. The gem in her hand suddenly darkened, turning a deep black, as if reacting to her words, after which she sharply squeezed it in her palm and quietly asked the young man not to tell anyone that she was a doctor, because even one careless word could cost her life. Then, after a pause, the lady began to talk about how, if the truth had been revealed, she could have been killed in many different ways, since the authorities cruelly punished those who dared to practice healing without the approval of the temple, considering it a crime against the established order. The lady smiled slyly, her eyes sparkling in the semi-darkness, and, tilting her head slightly to one side, she added that the temple persecuted not only illegal doctors, but also those who dared to resort to their help. And as punishment for this sin, the unfortunates had their tongues cut out so that they could never again speak of their healing. Nodding understandingly, the aristocrat calmly replied that he was well aware of the severity of the punishments for such crimes, and, of course, would not reveal her secret to anyone, understanding the mortal danger that even one careless word could entail, capable of ruining her life. The young man nodded again, adding that he would not tell anything even to the Marquis himself, because he knew how unforgiving he could be to those who dared to break the laws, and how cruel the punishment could be for such people, especially if the crime concerned sacred prohibitions. Slowly, carefully, showing all her natural care, the noble woman continued to treat the young man, carefully checking his back, assessing the condition of the wounds, carefully replacing the bandages and tying the bandages, not allowing a single mistake that could cause him pain, because the slightest carelessness could aggravate his wounds. In this world, the temple altar of discipline was considered the highest measure of power, and priests, dressed in white robes with gold embroidery, decided the fates of people, punishing and pardoning at their discretion, obeying only the laws of the temple, which for centuries kept the people in fear. The head of this temple wore the symbol of an eagle on his armor and banners, and the sacred order was ruled by the family of the Marquis himself, whose power extended far beyond the capital, causing the people to tremble, because no mortal dared to question their divine right. The temple was presided over and held the title of its supreme head by a man with hair as white as freshly fallen snow, named Yuvan, whom the people hailed as a hero, admiring his valor and righteousness, unaware of the darkness that lurked behind this glittering facade. However, it was precisely because of his obsessive obsession with power and perfection that the book's first female protagonist died, a victim of his ruthless ambitions, because for him human life meant much less than the opportunity to obtain something more valuable. But even after that, he did not stop. His greedy, power-hungry hands reached out to another girl, to her gifts and opportunities, because he wanted to get her abilities in order to increase his own strength, regardless of what fate this greed would prepare for her. When the lady acquired the abilities of a healer and the world learned of her rare gift, all the men, driven either by a thirst for power or a sincere desire for possession, one after another began to reach out to her, each one striving to make her his own. Without thinking about her own will and desires, Syrinx felt no joy at all in possessing the power of a healer, for this gift was not only rare, but also dangerous, turning her into a coveted prey for anyone who dreamed of obtaining it, regardless of her own desire, will, or desire for a free life. The beauty used precious stones of various shades in her healing, each of which had a unique power, filling her magic with a special energy, capable of healing even the deepest and most fatal wounds, bringing people back to life, even at the cost of her own fatigue. When Syrinx finally finished her treatment, she slapped her palm on the boy's back with a slight smile, as if checking how strong his body had become after her intervention, and then slowly stepped back, watching his reaction, catching the slightest changes in his expression. The lady thoughtfully watched her interlocutor while he carefully buttoned his snow-white shirt, hiding his body under the fabric, as if deliberately hiding from prying eyes the traces of his strength and fortitude, which had become especially noticeable after the treatment. However, the lady with sparkling interest in her eyes could not help but notice how muscular and handsome this guy was. His figure, chiseled features, and confident movements made her gaze linger on him longer than usual interest required, causing a slight excitement in her soul. The aristocrat, answering a question about his health, admitted with a slight smile that he was completely healed, and all this became possible only thanks to her efforts, gentle touches, and skillful possession of healing magic, capable of bringing back to life even someone who was on the brink. Syrinx slowly pointed her hand towards the exit, hinting that since he had finally recovered, there was no point in staying any longer, since she was not used to wasting time on those who no longer needed care, and messing around with fully recovered patients seemed boring. Heimdall hesitated, starting to nod his head in confusion in different directions, clearly not knowing how to properly thank the girl for her help. But she did not give him time for unnecessary thoughts. She simply silently walked past, leaving him alone with his doubts. The beauty didn't even listen to his awkward attempts to express gratitude. Instead, she resolutely began to push her interlocutor out the large door, pushing him so confidently that he didn't have a single chance to stay in the room. The nobleman himself did not understand how he found himself outside the door in just a couple of moments. He was literally pushed out, not given a chance to object or stay even a second longer, leaving him completely bewildered. But it seemed that he did not dare to protest against the decisive actions of the healer. Syrinx, closing the door behind her, thought with a relieved smile that she had finally gotten rid of the annoying patient, who had already managed to bore her to death, and now she could calmly return to her business, without wasting time on meaningless conversations and ceremonies. But she was clearly rejoicing too soon, because just a few days later, fate brought her together with this young man again. Only this time it happened at night. And it was not that shy and embarrassed aristocrat who appeared before her, but his other frightening essence. His eyes, scarlet-like flames, burned with madness, and his gaze was full of predatory, unbridled fire. He slowly approached the healer, shrouded in darkness, which seemed to become his second skin, exuding a sense of danger and suppressing everything around him with his presence alone. Syrinx returned home, late that evening, tired after a long day at work, hurrying through the deserted streets, wanting to find herself as soon as possible in the peace and quiet of her home, where no one would demand treatment from her or ask unnecessary stupid questions. But suddenly her path was blocked. Right in front of her, a man stepped out of the gloomy darkness, putting his leg out so that she could not go further, as if he had been waiting for her in this place in advance, knowing the route of her return, and was now deliberately preventing her from moving forward. Syrinx froze in surprise, raising her eyebrows slightly, appraising the stranger, not understanding who could dare to block her entire path at such an hour, because she did not consider herself such an important person that someone would decide to wait for her. A short bandit stood before her, his eyes slyly narrowed, his grin hinting at something unpleasant, and, tilting his head to the side, he mockingly said that he was well aware of why the lady worked so hard. After all, she just wanted to earn some money. The man walked slowly towards her, his movements confident, like a predator stalking its prey, and there was a dark determination in his gaze. He belonged to the Dark Guild, which meant he clearly had no good intentions, and his appearance only foreshadowed trouble. Frowning, but keeping a sarcastic smile on his face, he mockingly asked the lady how she, being only a woman, dared to behave so disrespectfully towards him, a man, and was also in no hurry to show fear in front of such a dangerous person. The healer's face immediately darkened. The expression became cold, bored, as if before her was not a threatening killer, but an irritating talker who overestimated his own importance. Everything about him irritated her, from his arrogant tone to his self-confident pose. Syrinx did not remain silent. Smiling briefly, she looked him straight in the eyes and, with obvious disdain, asked if he was tired of following her and continuing this meaningless game, and most importantly, what were his real reasons for following her. Suddenly, the scoundrel leaned towards the lady, almost touching her face, and with a mocking grin, whispered that she should not even dare to hope for help from her guard, because today was his day off, which meant that no one would stop him from taking what he wanted. In his long, sinewy fingers, a precious red stone glittered, shimmering with an ominous light, as if the darkness itself was pulsing within him, ready to burst forth, and in his eyes there was an icy confidence in his own victory, as if fate had already tilted in his favor. However, instead of fear, he was met only with ringing laughter. With an evil grin, the lady slightly bowed her head, allowing strands of hair to fall on her shoulder, and with obvious disdain, called her interlocutor a stupid freak, who even in the role of a terrible villain looked pitiful. These words instantly affected the murderer, and his face distorted with anger. He frowned sharply, and then, without holding back his irritation, began to shower her with crude insults, declaring that the only thing she could be proud of was a pretty face, behind which a worthless creature was hidden. The noble woman began to pick at her ear with complete indifference, lazily casting a bored glance at the man, after which she grinned, and noted with obvious mockery that he seemed to be overly excited, as if this was his first meeting with a woman who did not fall prostrate before him. Raising her eyebrows slightly and smiling with a hint of sarcasm, the beauty lazily noted that her interlocutor seemed to be shorter than her by almost a whole head, after which she slowly and gracefully sat down, as if emphasizing the difference in their height and letting him feel it fully. Catching the man's face distorted with anger, the lady added that, apparently, nature had deprived him not only of height, but also of brains, and this taunt sounded so innocent and sweet that it was completely obvious that she was enjoying every moment of this conversation. The guy, unable to withstand such insolence, jumped up, sharply raised his hand, and, without thinking about the consequences, directed it straight at the chest, clearly intending to deliver a tangible blow that was supposed to put her in her place. But in the eyes of his victim, there was no flash of fear, not even a hint of weakness. But Syrinx was already on guard, her body tensed, her fingers tightened around the stone hidden in her palm, and her gaze became icy. And at that moment, it was obvious that she was not just ready to repel the attack, but was going to make her opponent regret his decision. But before she could launch a counterattack and use all her strength, another man suddenly appeared next to them, and the scoundrel, who a second ago was ready to hit her, suddenly screamed, grabbed his hand, and bent in half as if from unexpected pain, clearly not understanding what had just happened. In front of her stood a young man in thin glasses who leaned over her shoulder with an imperturbable expression on his face and, like an observer at a theatrical performance, asked with genuine interest what was actually going on here, as if it was nothing more than an amusing spectacle for him. Syrinx, in a slight shock, slowly raised her head, peering into the stranger's features, and suddenly realized that she had met him before, because he was her recent patient, who had literally left her a few hours ago, having seemed completely harmless at the time. The robber, despite the pain, apparently was not going to give up so easily. He jumped up, roared in anger, waved his hand, and tried to strike the unexpected opponent, shouting something angry about who he even was and why he came here. But there was rage in his movements. But then the man, whose eyes flashed with icy determination, slowly began to raise his leg, preparing to deliver a crushing blow with his heavy boot, like an arbiter of justice who would not hesitate to punish the one who dared to challenge him. The criminal, like an autumn leaf torn off by a storm, flew into the air and, describing an awkward arc, fell with a dull thud onto the cold ground. And Heimdall only grinned, watching this spectacle with the air of a man completely satisfied with the outcome of events. His fingers deftly, almost casually, played with the blade of the knife, like a musician tuning his instrument before a performance, and in the depths of his eyes there was a cold concentration, as if he was pondering something important, known only to him. With serene confidence, he plunged the dagger into his opponent's hand without further ado, his voice calm, almost mocking, when he noted that it was not at all necessary for him to know who exactly he had the misfortune to encounter at that fateful moment. With a slight but mysterious smile, the young man in glasses nodded to the girl in greeting, like an ancient aristocrat whose look, full of hidden meaning, said much more than any words filled with pathos and feigned politeness could express. Taking off his glasses and smoothly approaching the girl, Heimdall leaned a little closer, allowing his voice to sound soft, but with a barely perceptible steel in its intonation, stating that probably she already knew him from somewhere, and, moreover, could well guess why exactly he was here at this very moment. With a grin that was both playful and frightening, the handsome man narrowed his eyes predatorily and lazily noted that if she did him a favor by honestly telling him everything that had happened earlier, then perhaps she would have a chance to save her life and avoid such a sad outcome. The deep, previously sky-blue eyes now flashed a rich scarlet hue, as if reflecting the crimson glow of the sunset, foreshadowing a storm. And this ominous fire in his gaze betrayed a change that was impossible to ignore, no matter how calm his posture remained. The noble woman frowned, feeling an uneasy chill run down her spine, and only one unpleasant thought flashed through her head. It seemed that the situation had taken a very unfortunate turn for her, and now she had too few opportunities to get out of this trap. But just recently, at the very beginning of this dark story, he coldly, and without a shadow of a doubt, threatened death to a secondary heroine who sat on the cold floor, her long pink hair falling in soft waves, and her eyes frozen in fear of someone who seemed to know no pity. This man was not just a criminal, he was a real monster, the embodied shadow of lawlessness, with scarlet eyes that glowed like coals, and a predatory smile that revealed a cruel mockery of the weakness of those who fell into his ruthless hands. His lips stretched into a lazy but sinister grin, as he, slightly bowing his head, noted that his patience was not unlimited, and if the lady did not hurry to tell him the whole truth, then her fate could turn out much sadder than she could imagine. In her thin, trembling fingers, the noblewoman tightly clutched the precious stone of a rich blood-red hue, as if it were her last hope, a talisman that could protect her from this nightmarish encounter. But the desperate desire to hide could not change reality in any way. The man casually tossed the knife from one hand to the other, deftly playing with it like an experienced magician, spinning the blade at different angles, sometimes slowing down, sometimes speeding up, creating the feeling that at any moment, this deadly blade could slip from his fingers and end up wherever he decided. With a sharp, polished movement, the young man parried the sudden blow of an unknown enemy without even flinching, and the next moment he quickly turned around, ready for a new attack, while Syrinx, who was standing nearby, immediately became wary, feeling that the situation could get out of control. A few steps away from them, a young man with a sullen expression on his face walked, cursing loudly. His irritated voice carried along the street like the rumble of distant thunder, foreshadowing an impending conflict that, it seemed, could no longer be prevented. The two men moved forward with confident, determined steps, their faces burning with indignation, and suddenly one of them, clenching his fists, shouted that they would not allow anyone to humiliate them, to trample on their honor and dignity, as if it were something that could be trampled so easily. The lady, raising an elegant eyebrow in confusion, watched the unfolding scene with mild surprise, especially when sharp, angry curses suddenly rang out at her, as if she had somehow become the culprit of all this chaos. Syrinx, completely not understanding what was causing such an attitude, slowly raised her hand and pointed her finger at herself, blinking incredulously, and then, slightly bowing her head with sincere bewilderment, asked why, in fact, all the claims suddenly fell on her. With a slight but confident movement of her hand, she waved her hand towards her former patient, casually pointing at him and calmly declaring that it was he who had dealt that blow, not her, so that all the accusations against her were not only ridiculous, but also completely groundless. The criminal exploded with a scream, his voice trembling with anger, and he, breaking into a loud squeal, declared that the sweet Syrinx had probably bewitched this blonde, subjugated him to her dark magic, and for everything she had done, she still had to pay, dearly, very dearly. The lady, clearly confused, opened her mouth, not knowing how to react to such absurd accusations, and immediately tried to justify herself, desperately explaining that on the contrary, she had done absolutely nothing to this robber, and that he himself was the culprit of his own miserable fate. After that, without hesitation, she extended her finger forward, and with confident boldness, poked it straight into her opponent's chest, firmly declaring that even if he decided to beg her, she would still not waste her precious time on him, and would not deign to even touch him lightly. And then, with a mocking smile that was tinged with icy contempt, the noblewoman lazily added that he was also ugly, as if fate itself had not spared him a drop of nobility in appearance, or in character either, thereby adding even more fuel to the fire. All this time, Heimdall, standing to the side, watched their tense dialogue with frank interest, clearly finding what was happening extremely interesting. His attention was especially drawn to this strange aristocrat, whose manner of communication was no less sharp than the blade in the hands of the killer. With a slight lift of her chin, she declared with a light, almost casual grace that her interlocutor was so unpleasant in every way that she would never agree to go on a date with him. And in general, even just meeting him was a disgusting idea to the depths of her soul. The criminal shuddered with rage, his lips twisted into a bestial grin, and when he opened his mouth, fangs became visible, which gave him the appearance of a wild animal driven into a corner, and, growling low, he ordered the lady in a thunderous voice to shut up immediately, not daring to utter another word. Syrinx began to tap her forehead with her finger carelessly, as if thinking, and then said with a slight mocking tone that there were rumors about the robber that not only his face, but his whole nature was far from beautiful. In fact, everything about him was terrible, both externally and internally. The man, sweating and clenching his teeth in rage, tried to break free from his companion's grasp, desperate to deal with this insolent woman. But his friend, holding him back with force, quietly whispered that it was time for them to leave, and that the boss would be displeased if they did not hurry. The robber winced and turned around, when suddenly a low male voice, filled with irony and threat, calmly asked if he really wanted to be hit hard and painfully, as punishment for his insolence and disregard for others. Supported by his friend, who held him like a wild animal in a cage, the bad guy could not contain his rage, and with a stifled evil laugh, he declared that he would gladly paint the face of this beauty and send her to the black market, where such as she could get what she deserved. With a slight sneer and a raised eyebrow, the noblewoman threw out a taunt, stating that, most likely, he would be the one leaving this place, not only with wounded pride, but also with a couple of picturesque bruises that would remind him of his careless words and hasty actions. Her face suddenly became serious, the slight arrogance disappearing, as a man's voice called her name in the silence. Frowning, she slowly, almost unconsciously, turned her head in the direction from which the voice came, feeling a barely noticeable chill of anxiety run across her skin. The man standing to the side smiled crookedly. A lazy grin played on his lips, but something sinister slipped through his gaze. With an unkind mockery, he calmly said that Syrinx was cold-blooded. Her eyes were empty, and there was not a drop of compassion in her soul, as if ice had long since settled inside her. The beauty slowly turned away, looking down. Her shoulders trembled, revealing her inner excitement, because she did not know how to answer correctly. Realizing that the man standing in front of her was dangerous, and any careless word could have serious consequences for her. They were left on a deserted street, where there was not a soul. Only a cold wind walked between the dark houses, whose silhouettes merged with the darkness of the night, and it seemed as if the city itself was frozen in darkness, watching them from the shadows, like an invisible witness lurking in anticipation. Breaking the uneasy silence, Heimdall asked a lazy question with a glint in his eye, asking what kind of relationship she had with the man who had just left this place. And there was more to his voice than just curiosity. Smiling dryly, the lady ran her hand over her face, wiping away a drop of sweat, and replied with slight irony that their first meeting could hardly be called pleasant, since this scoundrel wanted to rob her from the very beginning. But he failed, and now he probably had unpleasant memories. This answer was obviously to the nobleman's liking, because he took a step closer to her, and his gaze acquired an insistent depth, and then, leaning closer, he ordered her in an even but firm voice to answer him just as directly, honestly, and obediently, without hiding from him a single important detail. In a quiet, barely perceptible whisper, he leaned towards the noblewoman's ear. His voice sounded soft but insistent, and, playing with intonations, he whispered that he would like to hear the whole truth from her, so that she would not miss a single detail, and tell him everything with the smallest details. Keeping the same strained but impeccably polite smile on her face, the woman looked up at him with a cautious expression, and after a pause, as if waiting before making a decision, she asked a counter-question in an even, calm voice, wanting to understand what exactly he wanted to hear. The graceful female hand, as if of its own accord, tightened its grip on the precious stone, the cold surface of which flared with a dim reflection of the magic hidden inside, and, feeling its pulsation like a living heart, she involuntarily thought, realizing that this meeting could change the course of events. Looking away, the lady finally admitted that she mostly preferred to stay at home, did not talk to anyone, and devoted herself entirely to work, avoiding unnecessary meetings and unnecessary attention, as if she knew in advance that one day someone would want to ask her uncomfortable questions. Heimdall, lazily playing with the tip of the knife in his fingers, with a slight threat in his voice, suggested that she go inside her house, so that there, in a more private setting, they could discuss how she could know him. And at the same time, his tone left no choice, hinting that it would not be possible to refuse him. Inside the house, under the pressure of circumstances, Syrinx sank to the cold floor, exhaled heavily, and looking into the space in front of her, began to tell that she had once met her interlocutor, but in completely different circumstances, because it was she who saved his life and healed his wounds. The handsome man sat opposite her, not taking his attentive gaze off her, in which a dangerous mockery slipped through. His sly grin hinted that he clearly suspected something. But at the same time, contrary to expectations, there was no anger in his face, only a cold, piercing interest. The girl's hands, however, remained tightly tied with a rope that painfully dug into her skin. And this made it clear that the man, no matter how calm he looked, was in no hurry to trust, and therefore for now, he left her in this position, waiting for her to say something really worthwhile. Heimdall rested his chin on his hand and lazily tilted his head to the side, grinning as he realized how he had managed to heal so quickly from his injuries, a discovery that clearly amused him, as the puzzle now came together and all the pieces made sense, making him look at his interlocutor in a new way. The beauty, straightening her back and looking at him with a slight shadow of irritation in her eyes, coldly said that if he had now learned everything he wanted, and his curiosity was satisfied, then why shouldn't he finally show nobility and untie her, allowing her to leave? However, Heimdall only chuckled, not rushing to fulfill her request, because his admiration was not so much for her magical skill, but for her tenacity. Because confusing this girl turned out to be much more difficult than he expected, and her tenacity awakened even more interest in him. The girl began to list that she had long been accustomed to the troubles that had haunted her throughout her life, and, bending her fingers one after another, she listed events that could have broken anyone, but for her they had become a common thing, almost a part of her everyday life. Wincing again, she complained with slight irritation that her wrists were very sore from the tight ropes, and so she rubbed them together incessantly, hoping to relieve the pressure a little, but the rope only dug deeper into her skin, leaving red marks. Suddenly, the nobleman rose to his feet, and his sudden movement made the beauty shudder. Her heart sank for a moment in fear, but she quickly pulled herself together, although her slight sigh betrayed a momentary uncertainty, which perhaps gave him hidden pleasure. The man, as if noticing nothing, calmly and measuredly began to tell how just a few days ago he woke up in his room. Everything was as usual, but on the table a strange find awaited him, a piece of paper with an unknown address, which seemed to have nothing to do with him. With a slight grin, he slowly leaned closer, hovering over her, and in a quiet but clear voice added that he was a curious person, and therefore could not simply ignore such a strange coincidence, and decided to go to this address to find out what kind of mysterious meeting he had been assigned. Syrinx frowned, realizing how perceptive and attentive this guy was, as if it didn't matter to him whether it was day or night, as if he always remained equally focused, no matter the time of day, not allowing circumstances to throw him off. His daytime self, like a bright sun, and his nighttime self, like a cold moon, had no connection with each other, as if they existed separately, with no memory of what happened at other times. And this fact made one wonder how dangerous he really was. Knight Heimdall, following only curiosity, without anyone's advice or persuasion, independently decided to find that strange healer, a woman whose face he did not remember, but who somehow managed to bring him back to life when it seemed that there was no more hope. Rolling up his sleeves and examining his own hands, on which not a single trace of past wounds remained, the man quickly came to the only possible conclusion. Syrinx was an illegal healer, someone who was not recognized by official mages, but whose skills were undeniably valuable. Seeing what the young man was about to do, the girl screamed in fear. Her voice trembled with surprise, and fear flashed in her eyes as she desperately asked what he was doing. Had he really gone crazy? Because this was recklessness bordering on pure madness. In one hand, he clutched a bloody blade, and his other palm was cut with a fresh wound. And looking at the girl with a lazy but sinister grin, he coolly asked if she could handle this, healing him as easily as she did last time. His scarlet eyes, glittering in the dim light, held a threat, and his voice held a challenge, as if he was deliberately testing her limits, thirsting for confirmation of her strength, demanding proof that she truly possessed the gift that was rumored. Realizing that she had no other choice, Syrinx gritted her teeth and, feeling a shudder run through her body, slowly extended her rope-bound hands forward, showing that she was ready to submit, since resistance in this situation was pointless. Heimdall nodded understandingly and calmly accepted her words about his day and night versions being different from each other, like two completely different people who did not intersect with each other, as if two personalities existed in one body, having no common memory or awareness. Syrinx frowned, feeling a strange heaviness in her chest as her gaze fell on the deep wound in front of her, for despite the fact that she had healed others, the process of healing itself always caused her mixed feelings, and the blood running down her skin in scarlet drops caused a slight disgust in her soul. A soft blue light flared in the air, and a shimmering magical ball of pure magic appeared between her bound wrists. Obeying her will, it enveloped the boy's wounded hand, rapidly healing the cut as if it had never existed. Heimdall, watching this process, felt delight. His gaze was a mixture of amazement, joy, and some kind of sinister admiration, as if he was not just amazed by her abilities, but also saw something truly exciting in them, something that kindled genuine interest in him. The healer remained kneeling warily, maintaining a tense posture as she watched the young man closely, waiting for him to finally fulfill his promise, untie her wrists, and allow her to return home, leaving this strange, disturbing evening behind. Finally, Heimdall broke the silence, his voice surprisingly soft, as he said that perhaps he had been too harsh, and if he had frightened her earlier, perhaps he should have apologized, though there was no trace of remorse in his tone, only a hint of mockery. Leaning closer, almost touching her face, he whispered that in his entire life, he had never met a person who did not tremble before him, did not fear his own death, did not try to lie to save his life. And this, of course, aroused his sincere curiosity. After this handsome man, like a shadow of the past, admitted that he had previously taken other people's lives in cold blood, but for some reason decided to leave her alive. A mocking grin, full of secret meaning, slowly spread across his lips, as if he knew something that she did not. Slowly, like a tired leaf losing its connection with the branches of autumn, the thick rope gradually loosened, its loop sliding down, falling onto the cold floor, leaving behind a feeling of an irreversible denouement of what was happening, as if fate had finally made its choice. The young man, barely containing his surprise, froze, amazed by how confidently this lady said that if he really wanted to take a life, he would do it without hesitation, and therefore there was no fear, only the determination with which she extended her dexterous hands, freed from bonds, directing light magic at her opponent, which enveloped her palms in radiance. Syrinx, maintaining her bold and mysterious smile, with a slight challenge in her voice, asked if she was right in her guess, and at that moment her gaze burned with undisguised excitement, like a player making the last move. Feeling a powerful blow that seemed to be driven into his chest like a red-hot wedge, the young man suddenly recoiled, lost his balance, and fell onto the cold ground, rolling to the side, and in his head a roar of pain echoed, mixed with the awareness of his own mistake. Waving her hand to the side, the lady uttered an ancient spell with unshakable confidence in her voice, and the air around her seemed to tremble, filled with an invisible energy that, like a wave, spread throughout the room, foreshadowing something inevitable and truly ominous. With his blade in hand, Heimdall was fully prepared to rise, take a fighting stance, and begin to defend himself. But his opponent was faster, and before he could make a single move, a sudden blow knocked the ground out from under his feet, causing him to lose control of the situation. The situation had changed dramatically, and now Syrinx, standing before him, with a taut rope in one hand and a shining knife in the other, looked at him with the gaze of a predator, while he himself, completely helpless, suddenly realized that he had become a victim in this dangerous game. Smiling as innocently as if she were a fragile lily of the valley, the beautiful and wonderful lady, calmly, but with a clear note of challenge in her voice, declared that she was not going to apologize to him, because she did not doubt for a second that her actions were correct. Slowly, with a barely noticeable smile on her lips, she began to play with the rope in her hands, casually twirling it around her fingers, then unwinding it, as if enjoying this simple movement, as if thinking about what use to find for this thin but strong thread in the next moment. Bringing her face close to his, she whispered that she had skillfully used a freezing spell, but only on the opposite field, thereby completely immobilizing him, depriving him of the slightest opportunity for resistance, leaving only the awareness of how vulnerable he was now. After these words, she expressed with a slight mockery the hope that the young man did not feel offended towards her, because, after all, she had only treated him exactly the same way as he had once treated her, without hesitation. And this was her peculiar gesture of justice, her return step in their game. Reluctantly, with a hint of irritation in his voice, Heimdall asked what she was going to do with him now. But deep down, he already knew that her answer would hardly please him, because now all the cards were in her hands, and only she could decide his future fate. Resting her chin on her hand and looking at him with a sly smile, as if mocking his helplessness, the noblewoman finally spoke out, declaring that, of course, she would put him down, but only during the day when he finally came to his senses and realized the seriousness of his situation. With an interested, almost playful smile, his companion looked at the girl, and with a slight hint of curiosity in his voice, asked a question, wanting to know what would happen after this, when their short game of power would come to its denouement, and what step she planned to take next. Calmly, without a shadow of doubt in his voice, he spoke the truth, without hiding it at all, noting that if he ever returned, then this charming beauty herself would be in serious danger, and she should think about how justified this risk was. Without showing the slightest impression from his words, the lady lazily rested her head on her hand, and said with a slight hint of mockery that in that case she might well cast this immobilizing spell on him for another month to get rid of such threats. The handsome young man remained silent, as if considering the woman's proposal, but at the same time not expressing any protest or indignation, as if such a huge prospect did not bother him at all, and he was not even against becoming a prisoner of her whim for some time. Without unnecessary emotion, in a restrained and extremely serious tone, he said that he was not going to create any additional problems for the lady, and would not interfere with how exactly she decided to end this strange and protracted conversation. Syrinx, not hiding a slight mocking smile, slowly raised her finger to her lips and calmly reminded him that he was the one who started this whole game they were both now involved in, which meant that now he would have to come to terms with the fact that she was only continuing it according to her own rules. While they were having this tense and meaningful conversation, the man suddenly admitted that he had been acting like a narcissistic egoist, while the beauty, on the contrary, was simply trying to save her life, trying not to become a victim of someone else's ambitions, and not allow the irreparable to happen. Calmly, as if it were an insignificant action, taking the blade from the guy, Syrinx stood up without further ado, and when he, with poorly concealed interest, asked her about the exact name of the spell, she reminded him of its full name with a slight grin, in no hurry to hide any details. Then, with a slight hint of mockery in her voice, she added that this word translates as sit, like a command for a trained dog, thereby emphasizing the irony of the current situation, and making it clear that now complete control is exclusively in her hands. Then, waving her hand in a farewell gesture, she calmly and without further ado headed towards the exit, without even turning around, and, standing at the doorway, said goodbye to him in a light, almost joking tone, wishing him good night as if there had been nothing unusual between them. A new day had arrived. The sun was lazily rising above the horizon, filling with its warm light the narrow streets and low houses of the city, which was far from everyone, like a world hidden from prying eyes, where everyone lived by their own laws without looking back. When Heimdall finally woke up, he was already a completely different person, and next to him sat a stranger in dark glasses, who, in a breaking voice, almost crying, shouted that he was ready to take full responsibility for all the events of the previous evening. The young man slowly came to his senses, feeling his consciousness gradually clearing up, and the heaviness in his whole body did not allow him to move right away. He was completely tied up, his mouth was slightly open, his breathing was ragged, as if after a long restless sleep from which it was difficult to escape. When he finally came to, the silhouette of a familiar healer gradually became clear before his eyes. She was standing opposite him, casually throwing her sweater over her shoulder, watching him with a calm, slightly thoughtful look, as if assessing his condition. As the realization of what was happening dawned on him, his face twisted into an expression of horror, his heart began to beat faster, and his mind desperately tried to piece together the scattered memories. But how he ended up here, and what happened before he lost consciousness, remained a complete mystery. Without waiting for answers, he began to sharply turn his head in different directions, desperately trying to find his glasses, because without them, the surrounding world turned into a blurry spot, losing clear boundaries, and it seemed as if shadows and ghosts were hiding in this shaky space, slowly thickening around. And at that very moment, warm, soft female hands carefully touched his handsome face, affectionately, almost caringly, adjusting his glasses on the bridge of his nose, returning to him the ability to see and perhaps clarity in his thoughts, which were now full of enormous chaos. After that, he looked up and saw Syrinx in front of him. Her presence seemed to pierce him through and through, and, overcome with panic, he screamed that he remembered absolutely nothing of what happened last night, as if his memory had mercilessly erased all the events, leaving only an uneasy emptiness. When he, breathless with excitement, asked if he had done something bad, the girl only smiled mysteriously and, slightly squinting, answered with a vague phrase like, "Everything depends on which side you look at it from," and her tone only intensified the growing fear inside him. Feeling a dull anxiety rising in his chest, he stared at her face. The shock and horror of the unknown made him forget about breathing. And, overcoming the sudden lump in his throat, he asked the main question. What exactly had he done? What had he done that he should now be afraid of? Syrinx, barely holding back her mischievous laughter, slowly raised an elegant finger in front of her, as if emphasizing her thought, and finally, with a light, playful grin, replied that he had dared to unceremoniously pester her yesterday, completely disregarding decency, which, of course, had brought down indignation upon himself. Heimdall, slightly bowing his head in thought, slowly and carefully leaned the tips of his thin fingers against the cold floor, as if trying to feel its icy surface, plunging into his own mysterious thoughts and leaving behind only a light trace of movement. The handsome man, with trembling lips, barely holding back heart-rending sobs, suddenly fell to his knees, bowing his head low, and with tears began to hastily, incoherently, apologize, bowing over and over again, assuring her that he did not at all want to cause her a drop of mental pain or the slightest offense, even by accident. This unexpected, almost frightening turn of events caused the girl a strange, contradictory feeling of anxiety and regret, because she did not at all want to bring him to such a desperate, painful state, but only wanted to joke a little, to tease him a little. Even while shedding tears, Heimdall looked strikingly beautiful, not at all resembling a dangerous bandit, but rather some noble gentleman, as if he had come from the pages of an old fairy tale, where honor and dignity meant much more than cold weapons or strength. Frozen in bewilderment, the beauty could not immediately comprehend the meaning of the words she had heard, because the very fact that the man was ready to take on such a serious responsibility sounded too unexpected for her, almost unbelievable. causing her heart to freeze for a moment in anxious anticipation. The young man, despite all the gravity of the moment, continued to stand motionless on his knees next to the noble woman, not even daring to raise his eyes, only patiently awaiting her answer, hoping that she would take pity and grant him the forgiveness he so desired, freeing him from the oppressive burden of guilt. With a smile stretched like a thin mask and a calmness that seemed false, Syrinx narrowed her eyes slightly and asked in a cold, thoughtful tone how exactly the man was going to take on this suddenly declared responsibility. Not hiding her skepticism, turning away in embarrassment, the young man began to mumble something inaudibly, as if carefully choosing his words. But in the end, gathering his courage, he quietly muttered that, if necessary, he was ready to take full responsibility upon himself, even by marrying her, if only to atone for his guilt before her. However, the girl, having barely heard these words, immediately interrupted him, with a slight irritation in her voice, categorically declaring that she did not need any wedding at all, and the very thought of marriage now seemed to her something completely absurd, unworthy of even discussion in such a strange situation. The young man shifted uncomfortably and tried to object, reminding her that she herself had previously stated directly that he had tried to molest her, which meant that he really should answer for it, even in such an unexpected way as a hasty marriage, since the rules of honor demanded it. But at his words, Syrinx only laughed loudly, throwing back her hair and carefreely declaring that everything said earlier was just a simple joke, a light prank, and she didn't even think that he would take her words so seriously, believing in this harmless fiction. Heimdall, still shocked by her words, felt confused and even slightly depressed, but despite this, he could not resist asking, and, frowning, with obvious bewilderment, asked why then the lady tied his hands at night, if all this was just a game. He froze in horror, barely comprehending her words, because the answer was much more terrible than he could have imagined. According to her, he not only allowed himself to go too far, but even threatened her, although there was not a single memory of this in his memory, which only increased his anxiety. Wary, with obvious excitement in his eyes, the man slowly exhaled, and in a quiet, almost trembling voice, asked a painful question. Did he really hurt her? Because if it turned out to be true, he would never be able to forgive himself, no matter how much time passed. The lady merely waved off his concerns with a slight smile, carelessly explaining that, having noticed his condition, she had simply taken the blade from him, and then, for her own safety, had tied him up with this very weapon, since she knew all too well how dangerous even a familiar person could be. In their crime-ridden, fear-ridden city, it was always worth keeping your ears open, being wary not only of bandits and mercenaries, but especially of those who seemed completely harmless in appearance, since it was often the old people, women and children, who turned out to be the most dangerous opponents. After all, oddly enough, it was they who, possessing an innocent appearance, most often hid something dark, cruel, and merciless under this cunning mask, forcing gullible fools to fall into their nets before they had time to realize their fatal mistake. The lady stopped in surprise, frowning when she noticed something strange in the young man's eyes, an overly determined, almost desperate look that clearly betrayed a swarm of crazy thoughts that had already entered his head, although she could not guess what exactly he had in mind. Heimdall suddenly, without warning, leaned towards her so close that she could feel his hot breath, and suddenly, completely unexpectedly, asked her for help, from which the beauty, feeling a strange tension, involuntarily shuddered, trying to understand the meaning of his words. The noble woman immediately, in obvious bewilderment, quickly recoiled, looking at him with suspicion, and, frowning her perfectly outlined eyebrows, asked a question, demanding an explanation. What exactly he meant by this request, and why he suddenly needed her help, when just recently he had been so reserved. At this, the boy only leaned closer to her, his voice sounding quiet, almost mesmerizing. when he whispered with dark confidence that he was ready to do absolutely anything, make any sacrifice, if it would allow him to gain the power that she possessed, because now he craved it more than anything. Extending her graceful hand in front of the man's face, Syrinx asked him with slight severity to first calm down, pull himself together, and put his thoughts in order. And only then, when he regained clarity of mind, they could continue this conversation more meaningfully and without unnecessary emotions. The lady was certainly willing to listen to him, but she was not going to mindlessly interfere in other people's affairs, especially when it concerned patients, because she always adhered to the principle of not interfering in what went beyond her professional duties, even if sympathy pushed her to the opposite. Stood awkwardly, head down, realizing that she didn't want to interfere in his affairs at all. And this realization fell like a heavy weight on his shoulders, and his eyes, hidden under half-closed eyelids, seemed empty, as if he was trying to hide from reality. Slightly upset, he sighed quietly, and with a note of pleading in his voice, asked her to at least just listen, because the person who had committed madness last night was not him, but someone else, whom he himself could not fully understand, whose actions frightened him no less than her own suspicions. The lady involuntarily shuddered, barely catching in his voice a strange, confused muttering. And the longer he spoke, the clearer it became that he himself did not fully understand what was happening. Lost in attempts to explain his actions, and his words sounded as if there were two personalities inside him at once. Syrinx skillfully feigned surprise, theatrically opening her eyes and spreading her lips wide, as if stunned by what she heard. But in fact, she was not at all shocked by his words, because she was only patiently waiting for the young man to voice what she had long guessed to know. After all, with the onset of night, he seemed to lose his human appearance, turning into a cruel and cold-blooded criminal whose actions were not subject to either common sense or moral principles. And in this state, he knew neither regret nor fear, nor even a simple human conscience. And then, finally, Heimdall began to explain haltingly that he himself did not understand how to stop it, that every time night fell, he seemed to lose control, and when he came to his senses again, he no longer remembered what exactly he had done. And this realization each time only drove him more and more crazy. Syrinx looked interested, listening carefully to every word, because it was now obvious that it was because of his bad personality that the man ended up bleeding when they first met, which meant that his wounds were just a consequence of the battle with himself. The lovely lady, slightly narrowing her eyes, cocked her head to one side and reminded him that he had been brought to her door that night by a strange man who had called himself his friend. And now she would like to know who it was and what part he had played in this dark story. Shaking his head quietly, the young man admitted in confusion that he did not know who they were talking about, but perhaps this person really was the one, his night version, devoid of conscience and reason, unconditionally trusted, because he himself did not remember many things that happened in his clouded consciousness. Suddenly, the sweet lady, slightly raising her graceful eyebrow, gracefully extended her finger in front of him, demanding that he stop and not speak further, hinting that unnecessary words were completely unnecessary now, because even without them, the truth was already more than obvious. Smiling slyly, the girl said with a slight mockery in her voice that he could not bother himself with unnecessary confessions, and was not at all obliged to reveal all the secrets to her, because she had long ago made her conclusions and did not need explanations to understand who exactly she was dealing with. The guy, feeling the blood rush to his cheeks from embarrassment, nodded barely audibly in gratitude, still unable to force himself to look into her eyes, because even the simple realization that she saw right through him deprived him of all peace. After a short silence, he gathered his courage and hesitantly asked if she really didn't like him so much that she didn't even want to have anything to do with him. And although his voice was calm, a shadow of uncertainty flickered in his eyes, betraying his embarrassment. Nervously fiddling with his fingers in front of him, the young man lowered his gaze slightly, as if trying to hide his excitement, and thus made it clear that he was hinting at his appearance, because deep down he still hoped that this was not the case at all. But her behavior seemed to say the opposite. The healer froze in surprise, not knowing how to answer such an unexpected question correctly, and her lips involuntarily touched a slightly stupid, confused smile, because many thoughts were spinning in her head, but none of them seemed suitable to soften the situation. The guy, not waiting for an answer, turned away in disappointment, and there was bitterness in his voice when he quietly admitted that he was unpleasant and even a little sad to hear something like this, because he always thought that everything was in order with his appearance and beauty. But now he was beginning to doubt it, after which, lowering his head forward and not daring to meet her gaze, he said sheepishly that he was not as bad as she might have thought of him. And although there was an attempt to justify himself in his voice, there was still a hint of uncertainty in it, as if he himself did not fully believe his own words. The girl only slightly tilted her head to the side, her eyes reflecting slight bewilderment, because she did not fully understand what exactly he was expecting from her now, and his strange reasoning only further confused the situation, forcing her to wonder what was really on his mind. Slowly, choosing his words, Heimdall spoke again, this time more quietly, and, hesitating a little, began to apologize for having come to her without permission that time, forcing his presence upon her. But before she had time to answer, he suddenly moved swiftly closer, not giving her time to move away. And then, looking straight into her eyes, he firmly, almost in a whisper, said that if one day he appeared before her, again in the same state, would she be able to heal him again? Would she be able to lend him a helping hand when he again found himself on the brink? There was a subtle plea in his voice, hidden behind a mask of feigned calm, but his eyes reflected something more, the fear of being left alone in front of the darkness that lived inside him. And, holding his breath, the young man almost pleadingly asked her not to turn away. The girl gently but firmly placed her palm on his lips, trying to silence him, not giving him the opportunity to continue saying what was perhaps unnecessary. And there was no rudeness in her movement, only a calm insistence with which she tried to stop him. Her voice was calm, but there was a clear sternness in it, as she firmly ordered him not to throw words around so carelessly anymore, because in this alley, any word spoken in a low voice could turn against him. And therefore, it was necessary to be more careful and attentive. Hearing the woman's mysterious words about the fact that this time they might demand something special from him, the young man instantly tensed up. His gaze darted to the side for a moment, and then, realizing the possible meaning of what was said, he became even more embarrassed. With a smooth, almost playful movement of her well-groomed finger, the lady ran it over his chest, as if drawing invisible patterns, stretching out this moment, as if enjoying the feeling of power, making him hold his breath in anticipation of the continuation of this strange but intriguing gesture. With a sly smile, half jokingly, half seriously, she mockingly noted that such an attractive man as he could well face a situation in which he would be asked to pay off a debt not with money, but with his body, because such cases, according to her, are not at all uncommon in such places. The guy instantly jumped back, his face distorted with awkwardness and obvious fear. He couldn't even speak right away, but, having collected his thoughts, he muttered that, in essence, she could well demand anything from him, because from the point of view of logic, her words sounded completely justified. Syrinx, without hiding her amusement, with a chuckle expressed sincere doubts that he really had any significant experience in matters of love. And judging by his reaction, most likely, his knowledge in this area was limited to only vague fantasies and naive dreams. The beauty, slightly bowing her head, patiently explained that this area of the city was known for its bad reputation. Slave traders operated here, and naive simpletons like him should not behave so carelessly, otherwise they could find themselves sold into slavery in an instant. A young man who had to endure a painful and unforgettable experience in childhood will be unable to cope with the rage raging within him, and plunging into blinding anger without thinking will set fire to the entire city that dared to hurt him again. Clapping her palms in front of her, as if making a final decision, Syrinx finally nodded with a slight smile, making it clear that she was ready to fulfill his request. Although up until this point, she had only coquettishly evaded a direct answer, leaving him in agonizing anticipation. The stern man froze in place, shocked to the depths of his soul, his gaze darting over her face in search of a catch, because he had not at all counted on such an unexpected consent, which knocked the ground out from under his feet and deprived him of the gift of speech. With a sudden glimmer of hope, he leaned forward impatiently, peering into her eyes, asking in a trembling voice if she was really serious. And when he heard an affirmative answer, his heart was filled with sincere, genuine joy. In fact, her goal was far from selfless, because behind her soft words and apparent goodwill was hidden the desire to get as many precious stones from him as possible, which she did not intend to share with anyone, carefully thinking about how to make him part with his wealth. When the main character is the center of attention, and the whole scene belongs to him, it will be much easier for her to quietly disappear among the secondary characters, hiding in their shadows, avoiding the gaze that could reveal her true intentions. The young man blushed deeply, scratched the back of his head in embarrassment, and looked at her with gratitude, realizing that for her, helping strangers was not the most pleasant thing to do. And yet she went for it, despite her obvious dislike of treating strangers. The weather outside was beautiful. The warm sun softly illuminated the room. But suddenly the girl sitting opposite unexpectedly admitted that she always found it unpleasant to look at blood, and just the sight of it made her feel an incomprehensible anxiety that she could not cope with. Over time, Heimdall will gradually forget all the good she once did for him, and allowing darkness to overwhelm his heart, he will turn into a night criminal, a dark, ruthless version of himself, driven by a thirst for power and boundless cruelty. It is then that, leaving behind the image of a sweet, good-natured young man, he will finally cease to be who he was before and will become the most dangerous antagonist of this story, whose name will cause fear even in those who once considered him a friend. Tapping her finger on the floor, as if putting a final point in the conversation, the lady coldly stated that she had not at all expected him to say beautiful words about nobility, since empty gratitude had no value for her. She expected very specific payment from him for the services rendered. Blinking in surprise, the young man froze in place, his mouth slightly open in mute amazement, because he had never expected that she would seriously demand something from him in return, sincerely believing that her help was a gesture of goodwill and not some kind of deal with obligations. With a slight mysterious smile, the young beauty, tilting her head to the side, asked what he could offer her as a worthy payment for the help she had provided, and whether he really had something so valuable that could interest her. Slowly, with visible pride, the man began to praise himself, as if presenting a product at the market, confidently declaring that he was the ideal groom, smart, rich, with an attractive appearance, and in addition, an excellent cook, capable of preparing the most exquisite dishes. Syrinx, without hiding a slight smile, with confident grace, declared that she was not inferior to him in any way, because her wealth was just as impressive, which meant that his arrogant boasting had no weight in front of her and could not make the proper impression. She also added with a slight mockery that she already had a great friend who had outstanding culinary skills, and his dishes were always top-notch. So even in this regard, she did not feel any need for his offer. She slowly rose to her feet, while the man, still stunned by what was happening, continued to sit on his knees, and a fleeting thought flashed through her mind about whether he was in his right mind to be acting so strangely. Raising his head with both hands, the lovely lady looked closely at the man's face, assessing every detail of his appearance. And, although she did not notice anything outstanding, on the whole, she came to the conclusion that he looked quite tolerable, at least no worse than most. But suddenly, as if struck by an unexpected idea, he jumped to his feet, confidently extended his hand forward, and, enthusiastically pointing his finger, declared that he could very well be of use to her by taking up complex bookkeeping or sorting out important documents. His hand pointed confidently towards the table, covered with chaotically scattered scrolls, stacks of unsorted documents, and all sorts of little things that created the impression of disorder, as if hinting that this was where the firm approach of an experienced person was required. Heimdall, crossing his arms over his chest, pointed out in a reserved manner that there was clearly an error in her calculations, especially in those places where multiplication was required, and although he had no intention of appearing picky, he could not simply pass by this, knowing how important it was to be precise in such matters. The beauty suddenly shuddered in surprise, not expecting to hear such a remark, and the young man meanwhile calmly explained that she should have done the calculations not vertically, as she was used to, but horizontally. That way the probability of making a mistake was much lower. With a slightly embarrassed smile, but without losing his inherent charm, Heimdall casually noted that, among other things, he had excellent eyesight, thanks to which he easily noticed even the smallest flaws that could escape the gaze of others. The girl, without objecting, silently approached the table, bent over the scattered papers, and with a thoughtful expression, began to carefully study the calculations, trying to figure out exactly where she had made a mistake and how much this inaccuracy could affect the final result. The conversation changed course unnoticeably, smoothly flowing into a discussion of market trends, their unexpected ups and downs, while the young man slowly, step by step, approached the girl, carefully watching her reaction, as if choosing the right moment to unobtrusively offer help. Smiling awkwardly, she clutched the crumpled piece of paper in her trembling fingers, feeling the unpleasant realization wash over her. Was she really that bad at calculations that even the simplest calculations were wrong? And this horror was now squeezing her chest like a steel vise. Heimdall, crossing his arms over his chest and carefully studying the documents, calmly stated that he was ready to help her sort through this whole pile of papers, because, according to him, with the right approach, a solution can be found even in the most confusing and, at first glance, hopeless situation. The beauty slightly narrowed her eyes, pretending to think deeply about the proposal, slowly and gracefully resting her palm on her chin, frowning, and completely closing her eyelids, as if trying to mentally weigh the pros and cons, but deep down, already knowing her final answer. The guy did not take his eyes off her, continuing to insistently convince her that if he were her accountant, he would deal with all financial issues quickly and competently, because he possessed not only the ability to count, but also true devotion. So he asked her again and again to trust him. The girl, tensing up, slightly narrowed her eyes, and looking warily at her interlocutor, asked in a restrained voice what they were going to do with his second personality, because the prospect of meeting his evil and unpredictable other ego at night did not make her too happy. Without thinking twice, the handsome man, with a slight smile and even a slight chuckle, replied that she could knock him out if he started doing something really bad, and it didn't matter at all whether it was a frying pan, a fist, or any other handy object. Waving her hand to the side and slightly rolling her eyes, Syrinx reluctantly, but still agreed to help him, but only during the day when he was conscious, could control himself, and did not pose a threat to her, because at night she did not want to take risks, tempt fate, and encounter his dark side. These words of hers brought a slight but sincere smile to the face of the young man, who immediately beamed with joy, because such an agreement completely suited him, and he was pleased that everything had turned out exactly as it did, as if it were a successful outcome of long negotiations. Time passed, and one day he came to her again, wounded, covered in blood, breathing heavily, moving with difficulty, until, exhausted, he fell straight onto the cold ground, leaving behind dark spots that slowly soaked into the dust as a reminder of a terrible battle. The girl immediately fell to her knees in front of him, anxiously peering into his pale, exhausted face, and, feeling how everything inside her was shrinking with anxiety, asked in a trembling voice where he had again received these terrible, frightening wounds that could have cost him his life. The man was breathing heavily, lying on the cold ground, his shirt soaked with blood, sticky and dark, glistening faintly in the light of the lantern. And barely moving his dry lips, he croaked for her to stop talking to him in such a sarcastic and caustic tone, as if he was not bleeding. The guy just shook his head skeptically, not believing her cunning words at all, calling them complete nonsense and a ridiculous invention, because it seemed impossible to him then that his day version could give the order to knock out the night version if it began to behave too aggressively and dangerously. The healer, who was sitting next to the exhausted man, who was barely conscious, added with a slight grin that he had even allowed her to hit him with a frying pan earlier, as if it were something ordinary and completely natural, which caused her slight bewilderment. Mistrustfully, with a heavy and piercing gaze, the handsome man looked at her coldly. His red eyes, filled with gloomy fatigue, seemed icy, but there was something else in them, as if he was not going to let anyone get the better of him. The girl, interested in his reaction, suddenly asked directly, and without further ado, whether he even realized what a terrible situation he was in now and what kind of life he was leading. Because, judging by his condition, he had clearly crossed the line of self-preservation a long time ago. There wasn't a single living spot on the sweet young man. Bruises spread across his skin in painful spots. Blood was caked in deep wounds, soaking through his clothes, and his body looked as if he had just gone through real hell and barely made it out alive. With a cold, almost mocking grin that hid great pain and fatigue, he calmly stated that these were just the aftermath of a fight, and not that he had been beaten, because, according to him, he was not the type to allow someone to just leave different marks on him. With a hint of mockery and slight contempt, the beauty calmly explained that in his current state, he looked more like a stray dog, worn out by life, beaten, and having lost all sense of self-worth, than the formidable fighter he probably considered himself to be. The man immediately and sharply disagreed with her words, confidently stating that usually people first asked where exactly he was wounded and did not jump to conclusions, because he looked more like a man who was being beaten than someone who got into a fight and came out the winner. The lady, without holding back her cruel sarcasm, coolly added that his daytime version was completely different, not so gloomy, not so aggressive, and certainly not causing those around him the feeling that he lived solely for the sake of another encounter with pain. Uncomfortable, the boy froze for a moment, as if an unpleasant realization had come over him, when he heard it thrown in his face with brutal directness that he would hardly have the courage to actually wring someone's neck, since behind all his bravado, there was only an empty shadow of threats. The magical gemstone shimmered and sparkled in the dim night light, shimmering with all the deep shades, as if inside it was stored a piece of the starry sky, or a secret hidden beyond the borders of this reality, beckoning with its mysterious radiance. Sternly, with a cold note in her voice, Syrinx reminded him that it was she who saved him last time, when he was sitting on the street in exactly the same way, wounded, exhausted, and powerless. And now, he was acting as if he owed her nothing, which, of course, irritated her. The girl clutched her head, sighed heavily, and in a firm voice ordered him to behave more respectfully, to speak to her nicely, and to at least control his manner of communication a little. Otherwise, her patience could run out much faster than he would like. Her foot was planted firmly next to a small wooden suitcase, worn but sturdy, as if it contained something truly valuable. and its mere presence gave the scene an extra tension, as if some important secret was contained within. Getting to her feet, the woman began to complain irritably that she knew his nature too well, because he was capable of stabbing even a close friend in the back without hesitation if the situation required it, and could easily team up with murderers if it promised him benefit or salvation. Heimdall frowned with displeasure and was about to ask defiantly how she knew so much about him and why she spoke with such confidence. But before he could say a word, the lady sharply ordered him to shut up, not giving him a chance to object or justify himself. Leaning a little closer to him, with a sly smile, she ran a thin finger along his cheek, as if studying his reaction, after which she calmly but firmly stated that he should behave obediently and not test her patience, because now it was she who was responsible for his healing and could manage it as she saw fit. Stepping back, crossing her arms over her chest and tilting her head slightly to the side, Syrinx looked at him with a predatory smile, her eyes sparkling mischievously, as she asked with a clear hint of mockery in her voice if he had finally changed his mind about carrying out his previous plan. The guy's shirt was indeed soaked in thick, caked blood, covered in dark, uneven stains, and underneath it were deep, painful wounds that caused the fabric to stick unpleasantly to the wounded skin, creating an excruciating sensation with every sudden movement. The prudent healer took a strong, reliable rope with her in advance, intending to neutralize the young man and not allow him to do anything reckless, because she could not allow him to harm himself or others in such a state, especially given his character. She pulled his weakened, wounded hands towards her with determination, intending to tie them together, and, despite his weak, almost instinctive attempts at resistance, she continued to act coolly and confidently, leaving him no chance of escape or indulgence. The rough rope, tightly and securely wrapped around the man's wrists, cutting into the skin with an unpleasant, loud creak, leaving him no chance to even twitch, restricting any movement and turning all attempts to break free into completely useless resistance. Heimdall chuckled evilly and rasped that if she really wanted him to end up killing her, then she should have kept it up, as she was clearly testing his patience with her actions and playing with fire without thinking about the consequences. With a sweet, almost innocent expression on her face, the beauty tilted her head to the side, and with a slight, barely noticeable sadness in her voice, asked if he really still wished her harm, or if his anger was just a mask behind which he was trying to hide something more than just hatred. The charming man himself sat tensely, grinning with displeasure, like a wounded animal, from which emanated a heavy, thick, dark aura, filling the space around him with a sense of hidden threat, oppressive, cold, and ready to break out at any moment. Before stepping back, the girl firmly and confidently warned him that if he dared to hit her, she would scream so loudly that she would attract the attention of everyone nearby, and then he would no longer be able to hide from strangers' views and possible consequences. After these words, she theatrically covered her face with her hands, adding with a slight mockery that, being tied up, he would not be able to get out of the river in any way if he suddenly found himself in the water, and then his insolence and attempts to intimidate her would be completely useless. Leaning closer until their faces almost touched, Heimdall said, in a quiet but penetrating whisper, that he saw the fear in her eyes that she tried to hide behind her challenging tone and harsh words. But he knew how to notice such things. Raising her hand in front of her, as if putting an invisible boundary between them, the girl, with a challenge in her voice, sharply called him a pervert if he really enjoyed the thought that she should be afraid of him, because there was only one pleasure in someone else's fear. Heimdall, sighing heavily and casting a last piercing glance at her, nodded in agreement, reluctantly acknowledging her victory, for he realized that further resistance was pointless, and his stubbornness would only delay the inevitable. So he surrendered, but did so with dignity. The llama, bending gently towards him, extended her hand, and her touch was as light as a feather carried away by the wind. But in that movement there was a healing power that penetrated to the very heart, filling every cell of his body with a warmth that gave hope and peace. When he asked how long the treatment would last, the girl calmly, but with a touch of compassion in her voice, explained that healing with precious stones takes a lot of time, because this method, although extremely powerful, is accompanied by excruciating pain that must be endured. Syrinx, without stopping or being distracted for a moment, continued to heal him, enveloping him in streams of soft light, and he only sat next to her, his head down, as if the weight of everything he had experienced was pressing on his shoulders, forcing him to plunge into silence, filled with pain and hope. He, with all his might, holding back a scream, clenched his teeth tightly, trying to cope with the surging pain and feeling of discontent that was flaring up in his chest, because it was difficult for him to accept not only the painful sensations, but also the very fact of his helplessness in the face of circumstances. In the graceful palm of the girl, whose beauty seemed almost unearthly, rested a precious stone, shimmering with a mysterious light, because it was in it that ancient magic was stored, capable of healing wounds, filling the body with vitality, but requiring complete dedication and patience from the one who accepts it. Syrinx, looking down thoughtfully, quietly, but with obvious concern, expressed her opinion, noting that if he continued to treat his own body so carelessly and thoughtlessly, ignoring its limits, then one day it might simply fail him. Suddenly, the beauty unexpectedly ordered him to raise his head, and the young man, frowning slightly, asked incredulously why this was necessary, since he was not used to obeying without question, and her sudden insistence caused him a vague uneasiness. But in her gaze, one could read inflexibility. It turned out that the reason for her request was the need to heal his neck, so realizing the meaning of her words and not wanting to complicate the situation, the guy reluctantly followed the order, although deep down he was unpleasant to realize his vulnerability, forcing him to depend on someone else's kindness. Suddenly, the man, narrowing his eyes, abruptly approached his interlocutor, reducing the distance between them to a barely perceptible breath, and with undisguised curiosity, asked what exactly she was doing in this criminal area, whether she was a victim of circumstances or a prisoner here. Syrinx, without even flinching and maintaining an icy calm, firmly replied that she was not obligated to justify herself to him, much less answer his questions, since her presence here did not require anyone's explanation, and his attempt to penetrate her personal space could not force her to open up. The magic smoothly enveloped his neck, absorbing into that skin with a soft light, and soon there was not even a faint trace of scarlet blood left from the wound, as if there had been no pain at all, as if the very fabric of reality had been rewritten, leaving the past pain only a ghostly memory. Syrinx, without losing a second, jumped to her feet with lightning speed, and, shaking off her clothes, coldly announced that she had completely completed the healing, making it clear that her work was finished and she did not intend to waste another moment of her time on him. After that, without further ado, she turned around, took a step toward the street, and confidently walked away, not wanting to linger near him any longer, because her presence here no longer made any sense, and she saw no reason to continue this conversation. A woman's graceful hand smoothly reached for the door handle, intending to regain her privacy and peace, because the only thing the girl herself wanted now was to quickly disappear behind the threshold of her house, leaving behind this strange, tense moment. But at the moment when her fingers had already touched the door handle, the lady suddenly froze, realizing that she could not simply turn around and leave the young man alone in the middle of the street, as if he were an insignificant passerby to her, because something inside her did not allow her to leave without looking back. There was a piercing cold outside, inexorably enveloping the city, and the night sky, illuminated by the full glow of the moon, seemed to emphasize the emptiness around, reminding that the night can be not only beautiful, but also merciless to those who remained under its enormous power. Heimdall, hearing his name suddenly addressed to him, jerked his head up, feeling something in that voice that made him instinctively tense up, for it sounded not only decisive, but also a shadow of something that he could not yet understand, but which clearly deserved attention. The girl, looking at him with cold seriousness, offered him a choice. Either he would stay here, accepting the fate of a homeless wanderer sleeping in the open air, or he would give her one promise that she would consider valuable, and then he would be able to spend the night in her house, where warmth and peace would await him. Receiving only cold silence in response, the maiden turned sharply, casting a look of complete indifference at him, and dryly ordered him to forget about everything she had just said, as if her offer had never existed, and her concern was just a momentary weakness that no longer had a place. But suddenly, when she was about to leave, Heimdall suddenly spoke. His voice sounded with a slight mockery, and, narrowing his eyes, he declared with a sly smile that he was completely willing to fulfill any promise that she demanded, as if this game even amused him. The beauty, coquettishly raising an eyebrow, and with a smile on her lips, playfully remarked that behaving so insolently in front of the one who had just saved his life was not just stupid, but almost reckless. But then, as if mocking the whole situation, she admitted that in fact, she had no conditions. The girl lazily reached for her old wooden suitcase, which stood right on the floor, and, thoughtfully sliding her fingers over it, decided to tell the guy a story, perhaps to pass the time, or to make him understand something important that he did not yet know. Raising one thin finger upward, she reluctantly admitted that in the past she had been through a truly traumatic experience that had left a mark on her soul that did not disappear even after many years, like a scar that could be hidden but could not be forgotten. Then, smoothly raising two fingers, the girl continued, saying that her childhood was far from cloudless, because she had a cruel father whose severity bordered on madness, and two younger relatives, one of whom suffered the most because their father once seriously damaged his eyes. In her graceful hand rested a bright red gemstone, shimmering with a soft light, and lightly touching it with her fingers, she calmly explained that she had given this stone an oath to tell only the truth, because it was not just an ornament to her, but a symbol of her sincerity and strength. Frowning seriously, the lady adopted a mentoring tone and began to insistently order the guy to repeat after her the words that from now on he would no longer be a bad person, but would change, leaving behind his old habits and actions that had led him into trouble. At that moment, the red stone that rested in her hand suddenly glowed even brighter, and its magic spread through the air with a soft but tangible light, as if the universe itself was listening to this promise, expecting it to be fulfilled, and any deception would become immediately obvious. Surprised by this turn of events, Heimdall froze, staring intently at the shimmering artifact, and, feeling the magic binding the space around him, reluctantly whispered an oath, promising that he would not cause the girl any harm, remaining seated on the ground, as if acknowledging her power. The beauty, with a light, almost playful smile, calmly noted that if he dared to break his word, then nothing truly terrible would happen to him, but he would pay for his lie by being chained again, and fate would deprive him of the freedom that he still had now. The two of them went inside the house, where it was noticeably warmer than the cold streets, and the guy was given a sofa as a sleeping place, which however did not upset him too much, because the main thing was a roof over his head and the opportunity to rest after a long day. With a cheeky grin, the handsome man stretched out lazily and, with obvious self-confidence, declared that, of course, he would prefer to share the bed with her, hinting at a more comfortable and, perhaps, interesting arrangement. But his voice sounded more like a slight mockery than a serious intention. However, Syrinx only grimaced at his words, looking at him from under her brows with displeasure, and with irritated fatigue ordered him to speak normally, without these unnecessary provocations. because she no longer had the strength for useless conversations, and all she wanted now was a little peace. The young man, realizing that there was no point in teasing her any further, sat down on the soft sofa with relief, crossed his legs, and, stretching out in a relaxed pose, finally allowed himself to enjoy the warmth of the house, although a slight smile still played on his large lips. The lovely Syrinx herself was in no hurry to go upstairs to go to bed, because she still had too much work to do, and money does not earn itself, and no matter how much she wanted to rest, she could not afford such luxury until her business was completed. Suddenly, the silence of the house was broken by an unexpected sound. The door swung open, allowing the cold night air to rush inside, and another person appeared on the threshold, whose sudden arrival instantly attracted the attention of the young couple, causing them to become wary. He was a tall man with a noble bearing, whose strict and slightly mysterious appearance could have inspired respect even from the most daring interlocutors. His beard, thick and neatly trimmed, was gray, and on his head was a black top hat, which perfectly complemented his expensive coat. Upon entering, the stranger paused for a moment, looking around the room with a keen gaze, as if assessing the decor and the unexpected guest. But before he could say anything, Syrinx clapped her hands in joy and with genuine enthusiasm called him her favorite customer. Trying to look as friendly as possible, Syrinx, with a charming smile, stated that she had not seen this respected gentleman for a long time, and with slight curiosity, asked how she could help him this time, as if their last meeting was only yesterday. Meanwhile, the man sitting on the sofa turned his head in her direction, in complete amazement, not hiding his shock at what he saw. For the first time he observed how this prickly and sharp girl behaved so sweetly, friendly, and even caringly, instead of being sarcastic or arguing as usual. The old man, in the elegant tall hat, smiling, slowly raised his hand to his face, as if covering a slight grin, and with a slight note of irony in his voice, said that she, as always, greets her guests warmly, without changing her habits. Spreading her arms out to the sides in slight bewilderment, Syrinx raised her eyebrows innocently, and asked with a slight laugh if anything was supposed to change, since she was always happy to have wealthy clients like him, especially if they didn't come empty-handed. The old man slowly, with special importance, as if considering every movement, lowered his hand into the depths of his worn jacket, and, feeling a heavy bag filled with money, pulled it out, causing the fabric to crack slightly, and the air around was filled with a sense of the significance of the moment. Quietly, without a sound, like a night wind carrying secrets, he carefully handed the precious wealth into the hands of the healer, and she, with the speed and grace of an experienced master, instantly accepted it, as if she had been waiting for this moment for a long time, and her fingers softly closed on the priceless gift. However, there was something strange about all this. The man's hand was squeezing her fingers too tightly, as if he was not daring to let go or struggling with internal doubt, as if this gesture meant something more to him than just handing over money in a small bag. The girl carefully and with slight doubt asked whether she could, as before, pay him with pure gold, and in response received a trembling, barely audible consent, as if the man hesitated but still did not find the strength in himself to refuse such a generous offer. Stammering, the man, with noticeable excitement and impatience, asked her not to delay and to finish the matter as quickly as possible, since time was pressing, and all nerves seemed to be stretched to the limit, like a thin string about to break. Despite the fact that this mysterious man had long been her trusted and regular client, Syrinx suddenly felt something strange and disturbing, and therefore, as she left, she furtively squinted, as if trying to discern the truth hidden behind his anxiety, which disturbed her intuition. The beautiful stranger, without further ado and without a drop of hesitation, handed the man the ringing gold, in exchange for the very same weighty bag that had been handed to him earlier, and her smooth movements were serenely confident, as if she knew exactly what she was doing and what consequences would follow. The old man, who had been covering his mouth with a trembling hand all this time, finally squeezed out with difficulty what had been troubling him the most. Namely, with obvious concern, he asked the beauty to be extremely careful and not to lose her vigilance in the coming days. Syrinx froze in surprise at such unexpected words and, slightly frowning, tried to grasp their hidden meaning, feeling a vague anxiety, after which she asked a direct question, wanting to understand what exactly he meant and why his voice sounded so unusually muffled and tense. When her mysterious client didn't answer, but simply turned silently and walked slowly away, she, unconsciously giving in to a sudden impulse, sharply extended her hand forward, as if wanting to hold him back or at least make him look back and explain his words. But before she could utter a word, the door slammed behind the old man with a deafening crash, and this sudden, heavy sound, like a blow from a harbinger of trouble, rolled through the room, splashing into the corners, a viscous, oppressive silence in which something alarming could be guessed. Staring thoughtfully to the side, Syrinx tried to make sense of the words spoken to her, wondering if there had been any changes in the neighboring organization, or perhaps something similar had happened that could have alarmed her mysterious client so much. Taking with her the universal devices, she slowly but with extreme precision began to extract from the bag the things left by the client, carefully examining each of them, as if trying to catch a hidden meaning or notice even the slightest sign of something unusual. Her acquaintance, comfortably lounging in a chair nearby, lazily remarked that she had a very strange friend, since even he noticed how suspiciously he was behaving. Covered in sweat, tense, and clearly worried about something. The girl adjusted her glasses, glanced at her interlocutor, and firmly stated that this man usually never behaved in such a way, which meant that his anxiety was not accidental, and there was definitely some hidden reason behind what was happening. The man cocked his head to the side and thoughtfully expressed his deep thought, noting that people usually only acted so fearfully when they were seriously threatened by someone important, and the old man, apparently, was no exception to this unchanging rule of his whole life. In addition, Heimdall could not help but notice that the beauty herself behaved completely differently with clients. With him, the young girl was always arguing, rude, and sarcastically making sharp remarks, while with others she maintained icy restraint and an emphatically businesslike tone, feeling absolutely free and at ease, as if he were in his own home in complete solitude. He, without further thought, casually threw his feet up on the table, leaned back, and relaxed with blissful laziness, not particularly thinking about the reaction of his interlocutor. The girl looked at him with disappointment and obvious irritation, pursing her lips in displeasure, because instead of taking her concern and anxiety seriously, he only carelessly brushed it off, as if her words and experiences did not have the slightest significance. After that, deftly wielding thin tweezers, she carefully picked up a tiny, flawlessly cut diamond and, bringing it closer to her eyes, began to carefully examine it, admiring how the light glided along its facets, refracting in a dazzling play of glare and scattering into hundreds of sparks. Syrinx suddenly caught a strange but funny thought in her mind. The guy sitting opposite her somehow reminded her of a stray cat that had once stumbled upon her house, at first avoided her, watched her warily from afar, but over time got used to the warmth. To his curious question about what she was currently so focused on, the girl calmly explained with a slight smile that she was checking and thoroughly examining precious stones, trying to identify even the most minor defects or barely noticeable features. On the table in front of her, various tools were laid out chaotically, but in a certain order: a magnifying glass, sharp tweezers, paper with notes, a thin jewelry tube, and many other little things without which it is impossible to imagine the work of a real master. Taking off her glasses and squinting slightly, Syrinx curiously asked why he had asked this question at all. Had he suddenly developed an unexpected interest in her, or was there some other, more intriguing reason behind it that she had not yet guessed about. The man was awkwardly silent for several long seconds, as if digesting what he had heard, until it finally dawned on him that it was just an innocent joke, and then a mischievous grin flashed across his face, giving his image even more lightness. A moment later, he laughed, covering his mouth with his hand, and then, squinting slyly, asked with a slight challenge why she suddenly decided that he was not indifferent to her, or maybe on the contrary, she herself was secretly enchanted by his charisma, attractive smile, and impeccable sense of style. Playfully biting his finger with his sharp fangs, he leaned a little closer, demonstratively running his tongue over his top tooth, and with a sly glint in his eyes, asked if she found him truly attractive. Because, after all, he was a pretty narcissistic, handsome guy. The noble woman blushed, embarrassed to the depths of her soul, because the young man was indeed incredibly attractive, and his confidence only aggravated the situation, causing her heart to treacherously quicken its rhythm, and her thoughts to become confused, preventing her from concentrating and maintaining composure. With a lazy, almost teasing smile, the man leaned a little closer, and slowly grabbed the top button of his shirt with his teeth, slowly stretching it, as if deliberately prolonging this moment to enhance the effect and see her reaction in all its glory. And then, with his bare torso on display, he asked her, with a playful glint in his eyes and a hint of smugness in his voice, how much she liked what she saw and whether she thought she was looking at a living example of true male perfection, worthy of admiration. At that very moment, Syrinx froze, her face instantly filled with a hot, flaming blush. Her breathing became ragged for a second, her gaze twitched to the side, and her mouth remained slightly open in surprise, while she feverishly tried to find at least some reasonable words. But all her thoughts ran away. She quickly began to shake her head from side to side, desperately trying to hide her embarrassment, and at the same time, amazed at how shameless, self-confident, and absolutely shameless this guy was, as if deliberately testing her patience, enjoying every second of confusion. Returning to her desk and trying not to look in his direction, Syrinx began to sort through the documents, pretending to be completely immersed in her work, and in a firm, albeit slightly trembling voice, declared that she urgently needed to get back to work because she did not have time for such nonsense. The man just laughed in response, stretching out lazily, and grinningly suggested that if she ever became a serious businesswoman, she would probably be a strict and unapproachable wife, while he would be more of a butcher, jokingly getting rid of unnecessary people because everyone should have talent. The blue gemstone, shimmering in the lamplight, shone with dazzling iridescence, as if there was mysterious magic hidden inside it, locked in the crystal depths, attracting every glance and captivating with its mysterious, almost mystical beauty. Syrinx thoughtfully thought about how lucky she was to get this rare, mysterious stone at such an unexpectedly low price, as if fate itself had decided to give her a gift, which now shimmered in her palms, emitting a mysterious glow. Heimdall, feeling a sweet weariness gradually enveloping him, slowly closed his eyelids, allowing himself to sink into a drowsy oblivion, where thoughts, like a light fog at dawn, dissipated, and the surrounding world melted, giving way to a soft, enveloping warmth of serene peace. As the magical stone shimmered with dazzling reflections, its mysterious glow enchanted, lulling and plunging into soft oblivion. He sat motionless, his arms folded across his chest, like an ancient guardian, frozen in silent expectation, as drowsiness slowly overtook his mind. The lady held that very deep blue precious stone in her hands with trepidation. Her heart was overflowing with joy, and her lips involuntarily touched with a happy smile, because it was this mysterious artifact that could become the beginning of amazing changes in her life. On the massive wooden table, heavy, dusty bags were piled up in a disorderly heap, as if someone had left them in a hurry, as if they were hiding something truly valuable, mysterious, and incredibly important that could change the course of their further search. On the dazzling white canvas, Precious stones of all sorts of magical shades were scattered, each of which had its own unique value, mysterious history, and unknown magical power hidden in the depths of the shimmering facets, as if brought to life by the light of flickering candles. The woman, clutching her head wearily, muttered quietly under her breath, noting with annoyance that among all this dazzling abundance, it seemed there was nothing truly rare, special, and worthwhile, worth fighting for, risking, or enjoying this find. And suddenly, quite unexpectedly, Heimdall jumped up from his seat, as if struck by lightning, or an unexpected insight, and the girl, amazed by his sudden reaction, opened her eyes wide and asked in surprise what had happened and what could have upset him so much. The man's eyes sparkled with a cold scarlet light, filled with a hidden, silent rage, as if an icy fire lurked in their depths, ready to flare up at any second, incinerate everything around without a single warning, and leave behind only ashes, fear, and emptiness. With a light, almost casual movement, the girl took off her glasses and put them on the massive wooden table, at the same moment realizing how much she was frightened by this sudden piercing gaze of the guy, from which an unpleasant chill ran down her spine, like a harbinger of something terrible. However, a moment later, something strange caught her attention. Her gaze slid across the table, and, catching a vague shadow of doubt, she carefully reached out her hand to the old, worn bag, feeling that there was clearly something left inside that should not have been there. As soon as her fingers touched the rough fabric, alarm flared up inside her, and, instantly realizing the threat, she jumped up abruptly from her place, stepping back to the side, as if an invisible force of instinct pushed her away from the possible danger, while the thought of a trap flashed through her head, and in just one short moment, barely audibly cutting through the still, frozen air, a deadly blade appeared out of nowhere and rushed straight towards her with terrifying speed, its steel flashing in the dim light of the room, promising instant and merciless death. The young man slowly raised the knife, his movements calm and precise, his voice cold and dispassionate, as he said that it looked like her house would soon be surrounded, and then she would not be able to escape, because sooner or later she would be caught anyway. There, outside the window, in the thick darkness of the night, a dim figure of a man could be barely discerned, standing in deep shadow, like a ghost, watching their every move, holding his breath, waiting for the right moment to come out of hiding, show himself, or strike with lightning speed. Realizing that he had been exposed, the mysterious stranger immediately darted to the side, hiding behind the wall of the nearest building. His silhouette dissolved into the darkness, leaving behind only an uneasy feeling of someone else's presence and an impending threat. The girl, realizing the ambiguity of the situation, frowned, her thoughts rushing about in search of an answer, and now she realized that the client's words about the need to be careful were not at all a casual warning, but a real warning of impending danger. Holding up an elegant silver amulet in front of her, the girl said in a firm, confident voice that this relic had been stolen, and its true value far exceeded that of a simple decoration. For in its heart was kept a secret that could change the destinies of people, and inside it was kept that same legendary precious stone, possessing incredible power, which every nobleman, magician, and ruler in the great empire dreamed of obtaining, because its magical properties could change the balance of power and turn the course of history. Outside, in the dark night, the White Knights had already surrounded their house, like silent shadows, ready to burst in at any moment, and judging by their tenacity, they clearly had no intention of retreating, hiding in the shelter near the massive oak door, waiting for the right moment to attack. The lady raised her hand confidently and pointed directly at the ancient amulet, hinting that it was precisely this that the powerful count wanted to obtain. A man whose ties to the imperial family were so close that he could decide the fate of people with just a word or a fleeting order. Syrinx carefully hid the shining stone in a thick bag and, without wasting a second, explained that it was because of it that the White Knights had come here, while her interlocutor listened attentively, almost tensely, to her every word, realizing the seriousness of the situation. Tightly tying the bag with a strong rope, she securely hid the treasure inside, as if sealing not just a rare artifact, but something much more significant, fate itself, fickle and treacherous, which now depended on their cunning, determination, and ability to survive in this dangerous world. Heimdall, barely grasping the meaning of her words, raised an eyebrow in bewilderment, realizing that from that very moment he became part of her dangerous game, in which there was no room for chance, and there was no way back, only forward, through the darkness of the unknown and the impending threat. The lady, with a slight, almost mocking smile, confidently pointed her finger at him, and, with barely perceptible insolence in her voice, said that now, if she were caught, then he would not escape the same fate, because their destinies were so closely intertwined that it was no longer possible to understand anything. Without giving him a moment to think, she resolutely grabbed his hand and, squeezing it tighter, pulled him along with her, leading him away from this deadly, dangerous place, where the air was already filled with a premonition of an impending fight. And the only way out was a swift escape into the unknown. Heimdall, frowning, looked closely at his companion and asked with a degree of bewilderment where exactly she wanted to take him, what path they were going to take, and what kind of road lay ahead of them, because much depended on it, including their safety and chance of salvation. The lady continued to insistently pull him along, insisting that the knights were following them, and if they slowed down or began to think, they would certainly be overtaken, and then they would no longer be able to hide, because the enemy would be merciless and would not leave them a single chance. The young man quickly grasped the meaning of her words and realized that delay could be dangerous, but irritation still got the better of him, and he repeated his question with obvious impatience. Where exactly were they heading? To what place did this path lead? And did she have a specific plan, or was this all just a flight at random? Without another word, the lady confidently pulled him further, leading him through a secret entrance hidden from prying eyes, which was located on the side, behind a massive stone wall, and, opening silently, led into the unknown, full of secrets, dangers, and perhaps salvation. The beauty deftly opened a hidden door below, which led to a dark and cool basement, from where an old wooden staircase led down, its steps creaking under every step, as if warning that there might be no way back. It turned out that this secret door did not lead to a trap or a hopeless shelter, but directly to another house, a cozy tavern, the owner of which was her old friend. Inside, a lively atmosphere reigned. People were sitting at tables, mugs of wine were clinking, the aroma of hearty food was wafting. Her friend, despite being busy and all the fuss around, immediately noticed his old friend, and, as soon as he saw her on the threshold, greeted her with a warm smile, as if he was not at all surprised by her unexpected appearance, as if he knew that sooner or later she would return here. Before she left the tavern and set out again, the man stopped her for a moment and, with a slight sigh, handed her a bundle of things that contained everything she needed: warm clothes, some food, and perhaps something else that he preferred not to talk about. Syrinx looked at the man with gratitude. A slight smile touched her lips, and, wanting to express her gratitude for the help provided, she deftly threw a coin, which sparkled in the air, spun, and, describing a smooth arc, fell with a ringing sound right into the palm of her old friend. The man caught the flying coin without any difficulty. His face lit up with a friendly smile, and, barely clenching his fingers, he looked at his girlfriend with warm sadness in his eyes, perfectly understanding that this might be their last meeting, after which he said goodbye to her, trying not to show his anxiety. Before Syrinx left the tavern and set out on her way again, the man, feeling genuine concern, nevertheless asked her if she had changed her mind. But, noticing the firm determination in her gaze, he only sighed and firmly stated that next time he would definitely treat her to a drink for free. As his gaze lingered on her face, he suddenly noticed how serious she looked, and feeling an uneasy premonition, he lowered his voice, asking cautiously if she was all right. But the lady, sensing his concern, only gently placed her hand on his shoulder. Watching Syrinx walk away, the man shook his head, his voice quiet but sincere, as he wished her luck, knowing that this meeting could be their last. And he quietly added that he would truly be sorry if such a good neighbor disappeared from his life forever. Frowning in confusion, Syrinx looked at her neighbor with slight surprise, and, noticing the anxious notes in his voice, carefully asked why he was asking so many questions, what could have happened, and if anything strange had happened recently that she should know about. Suddenly, the man, lowering his voice and leaning a little closer, told her that lately his clients had been overtaken by something sinister. People disappeared under mysterious circumstances, vanished without a trace, and no one knew where they could have gone. And the rumors only increased the general fear. At this point, their conversation came to an end. They said goodbye with short but warm words, and soon the young couple, Syrinx and young Heimdall, left this place, moving quickly along the dark streets of the night city, where the shadows of the houses seemed longer than usual. But suddenly their path was interrupted by a sharp remark from Heimdall, whose voice sounded demanding, and even with a hint of irritation. He stopped in the middle of the road and, clenching his fists, demanded an explanation from his companion, trying to understand what exactly was happening around and why she continued to hide the truth. On his pale face, barely visible in the dim light of the lanterns, sweat appeared, indicating that his body had not yet fully recovered from the wounds it had suffered. And despite all his determination, weakness still made itself felt, giving his appearance a tired, exhausted look. And at that moment, when the tension hung in the air, a man's hand unexpectedly, and at the same time carefully closed on a woman's, and a calm but voice, sounding in the silence of the night, quietly, and almost with a smile, said that he was not at all against running a little with her, if fate required it. Leaning closer so that his breath touched her cheek, Heimdall spoke words that sounded like unwavering determination. And looking her straight in the eyes, he declared that he would not let her go alone, would not leave her under any circumstances, and was ready to follow her anywhere, even to the ends of the earth. However, Syrinx calmly reminded him that, in case he had forgotten, she had already said it before. The amulet that was in her bag was not an honestly acquired thing at all, but a stolen relic, which, without a doubt, was the cause of all the troubles that had befallen them. The man, hearing her words, looked away for a moment, as if trying to comprehend what was said, and, frowning, quietly asked if this thing really was the only reason why they were forced to hide, or if there was something more behind all this that she preferred to keep silent about. Syrinx slowly, gently but firmly, freed her hand from his warm grip. Her gesture was careful but unambiguous, and in this movement there was more than just a simple desire to free herself. There was a hidden anxiety in it that she was not yet ready to voice out loud. Syrinx waved her hand in the air, her movements full of tense energy, and there was a note of irritation in her voice as she firmly stated that the situation itself seemed too strange, since such a precious stone was unlikely to end up in the hands of an illegal. With a soft sigh, the noblewoman slowly held the ornament forward, letting it glitter in the moonlight, and looking at the deep hue of the stone, she whispered that before them was not just a trinket, but the tears of legend, a relic whose value was not only material, but also mystical. 8 long years have passed since the amulet was presented as a gift by the emperor himself to his sister, a young aristocrat with dazzling white hair, who, having left her native court, married a powerful and incredibly rich count. But after years, the decoration disappeared. Standing on a deserted night street next to her companion, the girl continued to tell her story, becoming more and more immersed in the story, and with a slight trepidation in her voice, she noted that everyone in the empire knew about this relic because it was mentioned in ballads, legends, and even in ancient books, which meant that there simply could not have been any accidental owners of this thing. But recently, this precious amulet disappeared without a trace, and the Count, not wanting to put up with such a loss, raised all his knights of the White Order, sending them to comb the black market in search of the missing decoration, in order to find and return the relic to his possession at all costs. It was for this reason that the guards patrolled the area so often, closely examining every passerby and looking for clues, because it was clear that such a thing could not simply disappear, which meant that someone was probably trying to sell it, not suspecting what a hunt the deal would turn out to be. There was still one more disturbing moment. The healer's client, whom they met the last time, behaved so strangely that his behavior seemed suspicious, as if he knew something important but was deliberately trying to hide it, or was himself involved. Syrinx listened carefully to Heimdall's words, who suggested that someone had deliberately set up the situation in such a way as to set her up by planting the Empire's amulet and thereby drawing her into someone else's dangerous games. After which, with a slight nod of her head, she made it clear that she agreed with his guesses. Turning around, she thoughtfully looked away, and then, casting a short but confident glance at her companion, calmly added that, in her opinion, the very same scoundrel who had drawn them into this story could well have been the same man who had previously so cruelly beaten the young man. Heimdall immediately guessed that the beauty meant that strange man, whose facial features for some reason resembled a catfish, and this unexpected guess turned out to be so funny that Syrinx, despite the seriousness of the situation, could not hold back a light, ringing laugh. With a slightly sly smile, she finally admitted that she completely agreed with his assumption, because that suspicious guy really did look like he was the kind of person who could easily pull off a scam by planting such a valuable jewel on her, and he would hardly do it just like that. She couldn't argue with the young man that most likely this catfish-like man harbored a serious grudge against her, which meant that he really had good reasons to drag her into this conspiracy. And no matter how she tried to convince herself otherwise, it was now becoming obvious. The girl squinted in interest and thought for a moment before tilting her head slightly to the side, and, with a barely perceptible note of curiosity in her voice, asked him the obvious question. Why did he still stay by her side, despite all the dangers that surrounded her? The man slowly put his hand to his chin, as if considering his answer, and then admitted with a grin that he simply couldn't hide, because at the very moment when he tried to leave the store, the knights noticed him, and he realized that running away would only attract even more unnecessary attention to him. Leaning closer, so that their faces were only centimeters apart, he said with a playful hint in his voice that now that he knew she had a safe haven, he had no intention of just leaving. And if she was so confident in this city, then it was high time to take advantage of her knowledge. With a wide, almost smug grin, the man added that since she had taken on his treatment herself and spent her energy on saving him, she now bore full responsibility for him, which meant that she would have to make sure that he not only came to his senses, but also did not get back into trouble. Frowning, the young lady, looking at him with reproach and slight displeasure, called him the worst patient of all those who had ever caught her eye, and the woman's words sounded like a sentence, leaving a trace of disappointment in her voice and look. The young man took her words as something of a strange compliment, and they both stood on a deserted street in the middle of a city swallowed by the silence of the night, feeling the cold that was creeping in with every moment and making their stay even more uncomfortable and tense. Suddenly, Syrinx grabbed her companion by the shirt and pulled him towards her, reminding him that she had done a lot for him, and that he should not forget how her help and treatment had required a lot of effort, patience, and precious time. After this, the girl turned around without looking at him, and, as if saying goodbye, walked away, agreeing, however, to return to that very place if the man so strongly desired to continue their conversation or to receive her help in the future, despite everything. With a cold glint in her violet eyes, she called the young man a puppy and ordered him to follow her, as if he had no right to his own opinion, but only had to obey her will without questions, doubts, and unnecessary thoughts, relying only on her decisions. The whole city was empty. There was not a soul on the streets. The stone walls stood gloomy. The lanterns flickered dimly, and the night brought more and more cold, filling the air with a feeling of hopelessness and loneliness, absorbing everything around, like a dark, boundless sea. When asked where they were heading, Syrinx answered briefly, without stopping, that their path lay in the second district, and her voice was filled with such determination that there was no room for doubt and attempts to stop them, as if everything was decided in advance and indisputable. A large shadow of worry crossed the woman's face as she realized that they would not be able to escape their pursuers, and that they would certainly be caught by the imperial guards, whose footsteps were already echoing in the night air, ever closer and inexorably, like an approaching storm. Suddenly, stopping abruptly, she clenched her teeth and looked carefully at the road, as if listening for something that could become a decisive moment on their way. And from this tension, the air became even heavier, almost unbearable, like a harbinger of something terrible. There, ahead, on the narrow road, stood 3 men with the yoke of criminals, holding knives in their hands, and loudly discussing something, not noticing their approach, creating an atmosphere of threat and alertness in the night air, saturated with cold. The rivet attached to the evil criminal's sleeve shone against the gold, while the symbol engraved on it seemed to radiate a dark and sinister energy, emphasizing the power and danger contained in his hands, and the deadly blade ready for action. Heimdall, watching the scene with a careful and reserved expression, realized that they were not the only ones in this dark place, and his gaze became cold and calculating, as if he already knew what was happening, despite the lack of any apparent emotion. Hearing the approaching footsteps and noticing the young couple, the man turned his head sharply in their direction, his face filled with threats and danger, expressing complete confidence that he was ready to meet any turn of events, no matter how they would unfold. The lady, clenching her teeth with tension, tried with all her might to remain unnoticed, avoiding drawing attention to herself and her companion, internally struggling with panic and determination, trying to decide what to do next, how to get out of this dangerous and unpredictable situation. Turning to the captain, the terrible criminal asked what should be done with the strangers, to which the captain, without showing a drop of emotion, gave a cold order to eliminate them, leaving no traces and not giving them a single chance of salvation. The woman held the magical Syrinx stone tightly in her hands, and although she felt tension and anxiety growing, her determination was unwavering. She was ready to enter the battle and fight to the last to protect her life and those with her. The sweet woman was well aware that relying on her companion's help was useless, because he was seriously injured and could not properly defend himself. So she set out to use all her strength and the magic of the stone to survive. The criminals, without wasting a second, rushed forward, their faces distorted with rage and determination, their eyes burning with the fire of readiness to use any means to achieve their goal, without thinking about the consequences that could follow their actions. The beauty used her magical power, and the magic stone in front of her hands glowed brightly, hovering in the air, filling the space with mystical energy, creating an aura of power and danger around her, capable of destroying everything in its path if someone dared to come closer. The young men, frightened by the power of light and great magic, hastily covered their faces with their hands, trying to hide from the fury of magic, not knowing that they would have to face something much more dangerous and frightening than they could have imagined or expected. But suddenly, Heimdall stepped forward, taking up his sword, ready for battle despite his wounds, which caused Syrinx a feeling of fear and unexpected anxiety, because he was determined and firm, not going to retreat, not hesitating for a second, even under the threat of his own death. One decisive swing of the blade, and the enemy was defeated. A strong blow to the neck proved fatal, and the criminal fell to the ground, deprived of any opportunity to continue the fight or to make any resistance at the moment of his death. Heimdall fought like a wild beast, fast, strong, and relentless, and the last of the boys, realizing that he could not defeat him, ran away, trying to hide, but was unable to avoid defeat, realizing that his fate was already finally decided. However, the courageous young man was not going to let him go so easily, and, having caught up with the fugitive, he grabbed him by the shoulder with furious determination, his eyes sparkling with cold and danger, a readiness to see the matter through to the end, leaving the enemy not the slightest chance. Without thinking, he threw the blade towards the fleeing man, and it hit its target accurately, piercing his back, causing a terrible cry of pain as the enemy fell to the ground, deprived of any opportunity to continue his escape or take any action in response. Thus, Heimdall, still in shock from what had happened, stood among the bodies of his enemies, defeating them, although they lay motionless on the ground, showing no signs of life, and he himself remained standing in complete silence, surrounded by lifeless bodies, waiting for something inevitable to happen. The man stopped and playfully told the lovely lady that if she decided to take responsibility for his actions, the consequences for her would be very serious and far from pleasant, leaving her with very little choice in this difficult situation. After standing there for a few seconds, his gaze still cold and determined, Heimdall, ignoring the dead enemies around him, continued on his way, confidently stepping into the fog, leaving behind only footprints and silence. Smiling slyly, like a true villain, Heimdall, feeling complete confidence in his words, said that since she understood and accepted everything, he expressed the hope that now she would make more efforts, realizing all the consequences of her actions and their further consequences. Syrinx, upset and depressed, lowered her head, her feminine lips barely moving, saying something quiet, barely audible, as if not daring to speak out loud, absorbed in her thoughts and disappointment in what was happening, experiencing an internal conflict. On the woman's hip hung a small bag containing jewels that could have been her only salvation in the most difficult moment, but now she felt only their weight, as a dark reminder of her goals, dreams, and desires, hidden from everyone. It was better for her not to use spells for now, realizing that her strength was dwindling, and if she didn't pull herself together, she could find herself in an extremely vulnerable position, unable to continue fighting against enemies as powerful as these, and losing her chance at victory. In her hand, tightly clutching the magic stone, a dim light sparkled, which remained her only source of strength and confidence. But she knew well that she could not lose her vigilance, because dangers lay in wait for her at every step and at every turn. She walked next to a young man who was a head taller than her, and at night he turned into a real monster, but the magic stone in her hand illuminated the path, showing them where to go next in the darkness, filling them with the feeling of some unknown force that was guiding them. Pointing her finger forward, the beauty said that this was the area they needed, with its empty streets, stone roads, and abandoned houses, in which there had been no life for a long time. And now everything seemed abandoned and quiet, almost alien to people, like a dead city. The young couple stopped near a lantern that was shining with a dim light that barely illuminated the surrounding space, but there was not a soul around, only the silence of the night, filled with calm and emptiness, as if the whole world was frozen in time, waiting for something important, but incomprehensible. The fire flickered in the lantern, burning like a weak candle flame, creating a warm but muted light that barely illuminated their faces, adding a strange, almost mystical quality to the moment, as if they were part of some ancient ritual or a harbinger of change. Syrinx, holding back her emotions, calmly informed her companion that in places like this, robberies very often occur, and the scoundrels do not hesitate to pester passers-by, creating additional threats and forcing even the bravest to be wary. After these words, she tightly clutched the magic stone in her hand, feeling its cold hardness, and continued on her way, with the confidence that here, despite the hidden dangers, it was relatively safer than in other areas filled with much greater risks. Suddenly, Syrinx stopped abruptly, feeling her companion's breathing become ragged, and she noticed with alarm that he was clearly getting worse. The wounds he had received in the brutal battle were beginning to make themselves felt, and fatigue, like a heavy burden, was becoming more and more noticeable. Wiping the sweat from his neck, Heimdall also stopped, turning around and watching her movements closely. And then, with a displeased expression on his face, he asked her with slight bewilderment if she had noticed how he had been watching her actions all this time, or if perhaps she was trying to hide something from him. The lady, gracefully placing her hand on her side, said with a slight sigh that they had not had time for the long-awaited rest, but despite this, she always watched with special attention his health, which, as it seemed to her, was clearly deteriorating every day. The boy's body was still recovering from the injuries he had received. His body was weakened, and his shirt was soaked in blood, which clearly demonstrated the severity of the trials he had gone through, barely coping with the consequences of a brutal and painful battle. Folding her arms across her chest and feeling his gaze on her, the girl grimaced, expressing obvious displeasure, and, holding back a grin, said that his appearance made her think that he was some kind of pervert or a strange person with inadequate behavior. The strong young man, slightly closing his eyes from irritation and fatigue, quietly replied that he was no longer going to embarrass or disturb her, hoping that his words would be able to calm the girl down and relieve the tension in this awkward and not entirely pleasant situation. Ended up having to bear some of her friend's weight, she put her arm around his shoulder to support him, and placing it around her neck, helped him to keep going, despite his weak state and the heavy fatigue that had overtaken his exhausted body and weakened mind. So they moved forward together, slowly and heavily. Each step was difficult for them, and the young man, feeling the full weight of their path, realized that, apparently, he would have to pay for a long time for her selfless help and patience, which she showed him on this tiring and difficult journey. With a sad expression on her face, the lady said that she had expected at least a word of gratitude from him, but she still continued to walk next to him, despite her fatigue and inner discontent, because helping him had become for her not only a matter of honor, but also an important moral duty. They soon reached their destination, Gargoyle's castle. The majestic stone wall towered high before them, and the light from the windows of the high tower softly illuminated their path, creating a mysterious atmosphere and enhancing the feeling of antiquity and mysticism of this ancient and mysterious place. Heimdall, looking around a little warily, turned to his companion and asked if they had come to the right place, and she, looking at him attentively and nodding slightly, calmly replied that he was right. This was exactly the place, and advised him to continue walking. At the very entrance, on the steps of a massive and majestic staircase, stood a multitude of men with a threatening look. It was unmistakable that they were criminals. Bowing their heads and crossing their arms, they directed suspicious glances at Heimdall and his companion. A man standing at the entrance to a large mansion noticed the approaching guests and, with a slight smile on his face, warmly greeted the young lady, expressing his sincere great joy at their meeting. Noting that they had all not seen each other for many months, Syrinx, continuing to help her good friend, blushed slightly, awkwardly waved her free hand to her acquaintances, adding with a smile that, indeed, they hadn't met for a long time, and that it was nice to be together again after such a long and difficult time. When they entered, they were greeted by an atmosphere of genuine, almost unearthly luxury. Expensive, exquisite furniture, every window and painting, told its own unique story, and in the center of it all, as expected, an important man was already meeting them, clearly ready for a serious conversation. The guard raised his hand and pulled back the heavy green curtain in front of them, giving his silent permission to enter, as if to show respect and admission to what was hidden behind that door, where an unyielding and deep silence reigned, giving the moment a special significance. The armor hanging on the walls were true works of art, reflecting the luxury and grandeur of this place, like symbols of ancient strength and nobility, covering the walls and creating an atmosphere of mystery and grandeur that amazed each of them. Young Heimdall was deeply affected by what he saw, although he tried not to show it outwardly, his red eyes slowly gliding around the room, absorbing every detail hidden behind the barrier of calm that he carefully and confidently maintained within himself, despite the inner turmoil. Without taking her hands off the boy's shoulder, Syrinx quietly and confidently explained to him that the owner of this luxurious house was a money lender, and his colossal wealth hid many dark and dangerous secrets, known only to a select few who could ever get into the closed circle. The young couple, with curiosity and wariness in their eyes, moved forward down the long corridor, where they received silent permission to continue, realizing that they were already expected inside, and that their presence had been long expected and carefully planned. Inside, in the office, sat a lovely woman, the owner of the house, with scarlet lips and bright red hair, engrossed in cigar smoke, radiating a cool calm and a certain imperious aura that immediately attracted the attention of the guests with her mysterious and tense presence. Syrinx entered when they were invited, and behind her, with a confident and firm gait, followed her companion, who did not lose a single second, trying to maintain steadfastness and confidence in his actions, despite all possible worries and inner doubts that could overcome him. The mistress of the house had long, graceful, pale legs that smoothly flowed into elegant, beautiful heels, giving her figure a special sophistication and grace, as if created specifically to attract attention and captivate the gaze, stopping it on every movement. She wore bright makeup that highlighted her expressive features, as well as an elegant black dress that fit her figure perfectly, complemented by a long braid that fell elegantly over her shoulder, completing the image of a mysterious and powerful woman, as if from another era. The green, cunning eyes of the beautiful mistress sparkled with a special bright shine, and under one of them, on her snow-white skin, a small mole was visible, giving the female appearance a mysterious aura, hidden, but at the same time incredibly attractive and enchanting. Placing her hand on her chest, Syrinx greeted the lady with a light and confident smile, introducing her with deep respect as the owner of the vast wealth and gold that filled the area, making her name a symbol of not only power, but also the unconditional influence that she wielded. Still holding a cigar in her hand with casual grace, the lady named Lintella Dulcinese greeted the guests with a sly grin, as if knowing that her every gesture and word would remain in their memory, leaving an indelible impression that would live long in their minds. The woman exhaled smoke, slowly releasing it into the air, and calmly suggested moving on to the important question of why they had come to her and for what purpose. Her voice was even and confident, and her eyes, as if reading them, were expecting specific answers that would help her understand their true intentions. Looking down calmly, Lintella asked, with an expression of curiosity and irony, why they were looking for her. Her gaze was penetrating, and the smoke, like a living creature, slowly floated around the room, creating a mysterious atmosphere in the air, as if she could read minds. Sweet Syrinx and her companion, without expressing the slightest excitement, sat down opposite the beauty, at two chairs in a large office, preparing for a conversation that, according to their assumptions, could turn out to be much more difficult than they had originally planned and expected. This magnificent lady, with her mysterious gaze and indescribable charm, always had a strange habit. She never started talking first until she took 2 puffs and blew out a cloud of thick steam, as if meditating before an important conversation. Covering her mouth with her hand, the lovely Syrinx, with a light and mysterious smile, calmly said that probably Madame already guessed the reason for their visit without them, because she was always aware of everything, having many informants located everywhere. Also, couldn't help but notice what a stunning and sophisticated lover this girl had brought with her. He was a gorgeous, muscular blonde man with piercing scarlet eyes that, like fire, carried a magical attraction and mystery. The woman kept her eyes on the guy, who clearly aroused her genuine interest and seemed to be intrigued by him. But Syrinx, without losing her confidence and composure, was not going to give him to her so easily, because she had already claimed all rights to him. So, with a little jealousy and some determination, the noblewoman placed her gentle hand on her companion's palm, as if to demonstrate that this man was already taken and would certainly not be her prey, and she was not going to allow anyone to take away his attention. And then, with a sly smile flashing across her face, she said with genuine confidence that this boy had long belonged to her, obediently followed her, and therefore, under no circumstances, even under the threat of the greatest losses, would she allow anyone to take him away, no matter how many attempts or obstacles there were. Heimdall froze in absolute amazement, unable to immediately comprehend the meaning of what he had heard, because just recently, his interlocutor had been cold, like an impregnable rock, had never shown the slightest affection, and now she had suddenly said that he was truly important to her. He smiled mysteriously. A spark of confidence flashed in his eyes, and, realizing that now was the moment, he approached her, slowly took her hand, pressed it to his chest, as if wanting to put into this silent gesture everything that would be too difficult to express in words. Having given a light kiss to her tender palm, the young man closed his eyes for a moment, as if finally realizing that he had long ago sold himself to his young mistress, submitted to her will completely, and now belonged completely to her, without the possibility of changing anything. Without hope of a way back, Syrinx sat down with a slightly strained but satisfied smile, inwardly glad that her companion not only quickly understood how exactly he should behave in the current situation, but also adapted to the circumstances without unnecessary questions, deftly avoiding unnecessary suspicions from those around him. Lintella, slowly tilting her head to the side, lifted the corners of her lips with a slight, understanding smile, and then calmly closed her eyes, not wanting to enter into a senseless argument, fully aware that objections in this case would only be a waste of time and energy. Suddenly, the tightly tied bag was suddenly untied, and when the thick fabric fell, revealing the contents, the imperial amulet was revealed to everyone present, after which Syrinx turned around with a squint, asking in an ingratiating voice whether the madam had known in advance what exactly was inside. As if not attaching any particular importance to what was happening, Lintella slowly rested her chin on her hand, portraying a bored expression on her face, after which, pretending that everything that was happening did not interest her at all, she lazily asked what this thing was in front of her, as if she was seeing it for the first time. Syrinx suddenly became serious, her gaze became colder, and her voice firmer when, raising the medallion into the air, she stated with absolute certainty that the woman could not have not known about its origin, because such things do not fall into the wrong hands by accident, and without the knowledge of the owners. Lintella just silently watched everything that was happening, the corners of her lips touched by a light, almost imperceptible sly smile, because, of course, she knew about everything. But now she was not at all going to reveal all her cards and give out more than the situation required. Syrinx, without losing her determination, continued her speech, confidently stating that this amulet was recently brought to her store by someone trying to set her up, and therefore now she had a logical question. Was Madame somehow connected with this incident? With a slight mockery in her voice, Lintella raised an eyebrow and, lazily clasping her fingers, asked how it happened that the little girl had managed to become someone's bait so quickly, and who exactly had she managed to cross if they had already tried to set her up. On the wall hung an old painting of a knight in armor, his stern gaze fixed forward, and the thick smoke rising slowly from his cigar gave the whole scene an atmosphere of luxury, power, and that hidden menace that always accompanied truly strong men. The lady, with a light, almost lazy movement of her hand, shook the ash into an elegant ashtray. Her fingers lingered slightly on the cigar, and then, exhaling the smoke, she finally said that the situation that had arisen had indeed been unexpected and, without a doubt, deserved close attention. Lintella changed in an instant. All the lightness disappeared. A cold tension appeared in her gaze, because someone dared to touch Syrinx, a person from the 2nd District who was under her command, which meant that the blow was dealt not just to the girl, but to herself. Syrinx swallowed inwardly, not showing it, but clearly realizing that crossing the madam's path was a foolish decision, because she possessed not only influence, but also enough cruelty that any misdeed would turn into a fatal mistake for the offender. The girl slowly held out the amulet to the lady, across the smooth surface of the table, its metallic gleam playing in the light, reflecting the dim lighting of the room. And it seemed that this elegant object concealed something more than just decoration or a symbol of power. After a short pause, looking expectantly into her interlocutor's face, she finally asked the main question, lowering her voice. If she got rid of this valuable thing, would she finally be able to feel completely safe, without fear of consequences? The beauty narrowed her eyes slightly, answering in an even voice that getting rid of this would indeed not be difficult. But then she added a vague hint. Hadn't the little girl forgotten anything? After all, if her request were to be considered a deal, something of equal value should have been offered in return. Syrinx involuntarily lowered her gaze, feeling the tension growing in her chest, and then, realizing that she simply had no other choice, she nodded reservedly, accepting the extended help, although she understood perfectly well that for every service the madam always demands due payment. The woman, with her lips curled into a sly smile, said that, of course, she was ready to help, but in that case the first request, voiced a long time ago, would be finally cancelled, which meant that now there would be no debt left between them. From now on, they would be equal. Lintella, with a slight tilt of her head, looked attentively at her interlocutor, and in a soft but insistent tone, asked the little girl not to rush with an answer, to think everything over carefully before finally deciding whether she was ready to agree to such conditions or whether she preferred to refuse. Once upon a time, in a moment of despair, Syrinx longed with all her soul for one thing: to leave this place, to break out of this world created by someone's will, to get rid of everything that connected her to this reality, and to disappear so that not even a ghostly trace of her presence remained. The girl clenched her fingers into fists, feeling the tension that gripped her body. Her gaze darted around, in the hope of finding that mysterious stone that legends said could fulfill any wish. All you had to do was touch it and say the cherished words. With her head down, but not allowing herself to show weakness, Syrinx firmly refused, emphasizing that she was not going to give up her previous request, no matter how distant it seemed now, and therefore was ready to remain indebted to the madam if this would ensure the fulfillment of her plan. Touching her chest with her palm, the healer, with a slight bow of her head, asked the madam to give her the opportunity to see such magical stones, knowing that such artifacts are rare and valuable, but still hoping that she would have at least one specimen at her disposal that could change fate. These words made the woman smile. She was amazed at the courage with which the little girl, having found herself in an obviously disadvantageous position, dared not only to argue, but also to set her own conditions, as if she was the one in control of the situation, and not dependent on someone else's will. In response, Syrinx, maintaining composure and firmness in her voice, calmly noted that Madame, without further ado, was well aware that she was not one of those who bowed her head before circumstances, not one of those who unconditionally accepted the rules, when there was always an opportunity to change the course of the game in her favor. Relaxedly leaning back on the soft cushions of the green sofa, Lintella looked at her charge and, slightly raising an eyebrow, asked with a degree of demandingness what the little one wanted this time. To which she, without changing her facial expression, answered briefly and clearly, "Pearls and a black diamond." The lady, slowly crossing her legs, with a barely noticeable smile and slight respect in her voice, said that Syrinx was certainly a master of her craft, a true jeweler whose ability to work with precious stones and create masterpieces could not fail to arouse admiration. Taking the initiative in the conversation, young Syrinx, with obvious interest in her voice, smoothly changed the topic to a more interesting and relevant point that could catch attention. She touched on the upcoming auction, which promised to be exciting. Every year this prestigious auction was held, and this time one of the most coveted lots was a luxurious tiara that belonged to the princess, decorated with rare blue stones. Everyone present at the auction was eager to get their hands on this precious accessory. Syrinx, gracefully extending her arms to the lady, with a light but confident gesture, reminded her that she invariably emerged victorious at auctions, winning the rarest and most expensive lots, which had become her true calling card in the business world, where her successes had long been the subject of admiration and envy. With a sly smirk on her lips and a glint in her violet eyes, she confidently said that, despite all her victories, the thing the lady had acquired at the last auction was in fact nothing more than a skillfully made fake, hiding its true nature under a layer of gloss. These words caused a menacing smile from the madam, and she ordered the little girl to remember that her words, full of confidence and importance, must be taken seriously, because they carry not only meaning, but also consequences that cannot be ignored. However, Syrinx did not feel fear and remained absolutely calm, continuing to stand her ground, confident in every phrase she uttered, not doubting for a moment her rightness and the importance of what she said, despite all the threats coming from the powerful madam. The girl proposed to make a deal between them, fully understanding the importance of this step and hoping that it would be a decisive moment. Although the woman continued to remain dissatisfied and doubtful of her intentions, not believing in the honesty of the proposal, if Syrinx's words turned out to be a lie, she was ready to give her life without hesitation, fully aware of the consequences of her words and ready to take responsibility for her actions, be they right or wrong, no matter how terrible it might sound. Lintella waved her hand towards the butler, giving him a clear sign to bring the necessary item for the contract so that all formalities would be observed and the deal could be concluded without further delays and unnecessary questions, leaving everything to the conscience of both parties. The ancient scroll, which served as proof of the truth, functioned flawlessly. If a person lied, their heart would stop and they would die, which served as a cruel but effective mechanism for punishing lies and betrayal, bringing fear into the hearts of many. After 7 years of using the forbidden scroll, its use was officially banned as its power and effects became too destructive, and society could no longer tolerate its use in everyday life despite its power. Syrinx, with a determined and confident smile on her face, slowly raised her hand and, without hesitation, tore the piece of paper, leaving the space filled with the echo of this action, as a harbinger of something significant and inevitable that could not be stopped. The sound of paper snapping echoed through the room, breaking the silence, and Madame, who was watching the proceedings, looked at it with a cold and penetrating gaze that felt much heavier and more threatening than any spoken word or strange gesture. The lady sat opposite the beauty, and they both found themselves in the office, alone, in a mysterious silence, when only their glances and the air around filled the space with tension, as if every word could decide their fate. A deep silence reigned in the room, hanging in the air like something inevitable and heavy, and the noble woman's face became ominous, her teeth, as if ready to tear everything in their path, gnashed in a grin, and her eyebrows, frowning to the limit, reflected her stormy inner rage. Grabbing her head in her hands, the noblewoman realized with great horror that she had suddenly been deceived, and the princess's crown, which she had dreamed of wearing for so long, turned out to be nothing more than a cheap fake decoration, helplessly lying under her fingernails on the cold floor. Syrinx, with a sly and cunning smile, suggested doing the same thing as before, making another similar fake and selling it at auction to competitors, thereby getting rich at their expense, leaving them in complete ignorance, disappointment, and defeat. Thoughtfully, Madame nervously tapped her fingers on her knee. Her red nails, which she had always considered a symbol of pride, strength, and power, now seemed even more important to her because she could not believe that she had been so basely deceived and her dignity insulted. As soon as the young Syrinx met her rival's gaze, he stared at her without taking his eyes off her, as if trying to figure out her various hidden intentions, not realizing that she was much smarter, more cunning, and more experienced than he could have imagined at first glance. Looking down on her, the madam turned to the little girl with disdain, mockingly asking if she was going to make a fake, a black diamond so similar to the imperial amulet, which could become the key to her evil plan and give her incredible power. Clenching her fist in front of her, Syrinx answered confidently that she could do it, because she was ready to do everything necessary to achieve her goal, and nothing, no obstacles, no doubts, could stop her on this difficult and dangerous path that she had long ago chosen for herself. After that, she realized that she needed to pick up the bag with the medallion, and also needed fake IDs in order to leave no traces and successfully complete her cunning and carefully thought-out plans that always brought her success. The woman, lounging on the sofa, realized that she was quite capable of handling this, because with her influence, wide connections, and impeccable authority, such tasks did not present any particular difficulty for her and could not become an obstacle to her decisive steps and inevitable victory. Listening carefully to the proposals, she realized that if everything was carried out according to her cunning plan, she would be able to restore her lost honor and influence by deceiving everyone around her, without attracting unnecessary attention, and without the slightest consequences for herself and her reputation. Syrinx continued to say that they would then be able to restore the lady's dignity and expose her to everyone, proving that they had sold her a fake, thus avenging the deception and restoring the justice that was so important to their plan, undermining the credibility of her reputation. With a frown and cold green eyes, the madam said that she sympathized with the little girl's honesty and ideas, and expressed the hope that she would not disappoint her, would not let her down, but, on the contrary, would do everything as planned, without mistakes or delays, earning her trust. At this point, the conversation between the two ladies ended. They sat opposite each other, silent, immersed in their thoughts, carefully considering the next steps that could lead them to the long-awaited victory and success, despite all the risks and difficulties that would inevitably arise along the way. The butler brought all her things on a tray, including the bag and papers she had left behind. And with a slight wave of her hand, Syrinx, without losing confidence, replied that the finished product would be completed and delivered the day after tomorrow, as promised earlier. Without the slightest delay, the girl took her things with slight satisfaction, among which was a handbag with a diamond, her personal treasure, carefully hidden in a hidden pocket. Realizing that this item was the key to her further success and the implementation of a carefully thought-out plan. After this, she calmly waved her hand, discreetly and confidently, telling her companion that they could now go, since all the important steps had been successfully completed, and the remaining affairs no longer required their participation, which freed them for new, more significant actions. However, the imperious madam suddenly stopped her, saying in a reserved and almost thoughtful tone that, of course, she would benefit from what would happen at the auction. But the important question remained open. What benefit would there be for her, and what was she willing to invest in this process so that her interests would be taken into account? Syrinx did the smart thing. She grabbed the red rose and said with determination that this would be her payment, symbolizing her deal. confident that with such a gesture, she emphasized her determination and pragmatism, hoping that her offer would be accepted at the proper level and would not cause any doubts. After these beautiful words, she added that she hoped that the lady would fulfill her request as promised, because for her it was of great importance, opening up new prospects for cooperation and important opportunities that could change their relationship for the better and strengthen their union. However, Madame insisted that Syrinx offer her another jewel, stating that she wished to receive something much more valuable than the rose, and hinted that it should be something truly exceptional, like her lover, who was truly beautiful. With an apologetic smile, Syrinx refused, explaining that she had acquired the boy herself, and now he belonged entirely to her, and could not be given to anyone else, no matter how much the madam wanted it, because she had invested her own value in him, which she did not allow to be taken away. Syrinx smiled resolutely and suddenly tore the paper, without thinking about the consequences, as if it was part of her carefully thought-out plan that she had long thought about. And at this decisive moment, she was ready to put it into action, not allowing doubts to interfere. It cracked in two under Madame's gaze, and the sound of the paper tearing echoed throughout the room, giving the moment tension and uncertainty, as if the air had become heavy, filled with anxiety and vague premonitions, squeezing a fragile heart. There was a silence in the room, and the lovely lady's face became sinister, her teeth clenched and her brows furrowed in rage, as if she was preparing for something that would radically change the course of all events and put everything on the line. Her anger becoming more and more obvious. Looking at the lady, the man firmly stated that he had already sold out and had no intention of starting an affair with her, adding that he already had a mistress, with insolence in his voice, not hiding his decisive attitude, completely confident in his decision and ready to defend his position. Moths flew towards the light of the lantern, their black silhouettes flickering, illuminating the street, and the night enveloped everything around, adding mystery and tranquility to the atmosphere, which seemed almost magical, making everything around seem more alive and real. The young couple went out into the street and walked along the road forward through the city, where there were only a few people, just a few, in this nocturnal and quiet place, where time seemed to have stopped, and the whole world was far away, hiding in the shadows, as if it did not exist at that moment. The two of them walked behind the guards who moved ahead, and they walked one after the other, never losing sight of each other, creating a feeling of mutual support and security, as if they were a single force directed towards a common goal, without doubting their path and without looking back. Turning around, the man told the lady that her friend was clearly injured, and they had already prepared a first aid kit for them to help, to which Syrinx thanked them for their care and consideration, feeling deeply grateful for their support and sincere desire to help. The woman's hand took the thing that the man's hand was holding out, and the gesture seemed simple, but there was something deeper in it, reflecting their indescribable connection and the trust that gradually grew between them with each of their actions and each new step forward, as if they were becoming one. With a smile, she took the key to the room where they could stay, and this gesture was filled with a slight hope and calm, as if behind the huge door, a long-awaited rest and safety awaited them in this temporary shelter, full of peace and quiet, with the promise of a new beginning. After the madame's subordinate left, waving goodbye, Syrinx remained alone with her companion on the street, where the silence of the night gently enveloped them, creating an atmosphere of deep calm and solitude, as if the whole world had frozen and left them alone with their thoughts. The night was clear, and the stars in the sky twinkled like tiny lights, adding magic to the moment and filling the world with a mysterious light that was reflected in their eyes, creating the feeling that the sky was breathing in unison with them, as if the entire cosmos was next to them. Turning to her patient, the healer suggested that they continue on their way, because now that the night's silence had fallen on the city, they could find a place to stay for the night, to rest and recuperate, preparing for the next trials that still awaited them along the way. In her hand, a bright yellow stone was burning, glowing like a small sun, its radiance softly reflected in the air, filling the space around them with warmth and hope, as if this stone was a symbol of their future, illuminating the way forward. The beauty walked forward, and the stone illuminated the way. But the bad Heimdall was in no hurry to follow her, remaining in the shadows and carefully watching her every move, as if he was hiding something from her, preparing for the decisive moment that was yet to come. Finally, slowly and decisively, he took a step forward, as if pondering his next move, and his presence in the silence of the night became even more noticeable, giving everything that was happening tension and uncertainty, which was reflected in his cold gaze. The two of them walked along the road, passing strange houses whose windows glowed dimly in the night. But the silence remained around them, absorbing all sounds, as if their path was blocked by the world, and they were cut off from everything that could distract them or help them. While Syrinx could not see her companion's face, his expression became more and more dangerous and cruel, as if every step he took brought her closer to an inevitable threat, and his intentions towards her became so clear and obvious that she felt as if he was about to draw a dagger. Suddenly, there was a sharp blow, and the gem was shattered in half, its light vanishing in an instant, swallowed by the merciless darkness. And Syrinx stopped in horror, realizing that something terrible and irreversible had happened that could greatly change her destiny forever. Her companion grabbed her shoulder sharply, and fear was reflected in his eyes, which only increased the tension in this moment, when everything around suddenly became threatening, and danger hung in the air, squeezing the space around, making their every step more dangerous. Heimdall immediately threw her against the wall and pinned her to it, depriving her of the opportunity to maneuver, and there was no way out of this cruel action. The situation was hopeless, and the people around them disappeared, leaving them alone with this nightmare, without any hope of help. The young man's face was set in grim determination, and in his hands a blade gleamed, ready to rip the silence with a sharp movement, like a predator lurking before a deadly leap. There was no doubt in his gaze, only the cold certainty of one who had already accepted the inevitable outcome. In the original version of the story, Heimdall acquired the crown by buying it from the feudal lord for a considerable sum, like a noble collector eager to get his hands on a rare artifact that could not only decorate his domain, but also strengthen his influence in the world of political intrigue. And when he finally learned that the diadem he had bought with such pride turned out to be nothing more than a clever fake, anger seized him with furious force, and, unable to restrain his rage, he rushed at the deceitful feudal lord, thirsting to restore justice and return his lost honor. Pressing the fragile girl with his strong body, he demanded an explanation from her in a harsh voice, wanting to know how she knew that the crown he had paid so dearly for was only a cheap imitation, created by the dexterous hands of a skilled deceiver. The lady calmly explained that she had seen this crown before, and therefore was able to unmistakably determine its authenticity by the features of the cut of the precious stone, because a true masterpiece of jewelry art cannot be confused with a crude fake, no matter how skillful it may be. The girl had no difficulty in recognizing the fake, having barely glanced at the elegant tiara lying on the table during the reception. The stones, which should have shone with pure heavenly light, seemed dull, lifeless, as if they did not have the soul of a real precious piece. After that, Syrinx, without hiding her mockery, smirked and asked defiantly if the guy really had a special passion to so unceremoniously deprive people of freedom of movement, driving them into a corner, like a predator playing with its helpless victim before the final blow. The girl desperately grabbed the rough fabric of his shirt, trying with all her might to push him away, but she felt only the strength of the man's body, not giving in to her resistance, as if he were not a man, but an unyielding stone block. With a cold blade at her throat, the girl only smirked and mockingly noted that he was clearly not the type to take matters seriously, but rather acted like a careless player who saw what was happening as just fun, without realizing all the consequences. Placing his hand on her head, Heimdall asked her with mild curiosity if she had ever really thought about acquiring him, to which she, without the slightest hesitation, answered rudely and defiantly that she was not used to buying cheap things, without hiding either ridicule or contempt. Her sharp answer only made him smirk, because even though he was considered cheap, he knew very well that he had an attractive appearance, and therefore he perceived any such words more as a game than as something that could really hurt his pride. Syrinx broke free from her companion's grasp and, without turning around, walked away, confidently declaring that she did not need an ornament that could become her undoing, and perhaps even disrupt the inner harmony that she valued so much and which gave her strength. However, she stopped when a man addressed her, and in his hand a precious stone froze, mysteriously hovering in the air, as if shrouded in magical power, and everything around, as if by magic, instantly became silent, absorbed by this amazing and mysterious phenomenon. The antagonist of the novel, observing what was happening, began to reflect that this woman had a weak body and not outstanding abilities, and it seemed that her strength lay precisely in the magic stones that she carried with her, despite her external vulnerability and inexperience. Annoyed by her behavior, the beauty, unable to restrain herself, mockingly asked if the guy really wanted to fight her right now, and if so, then she was ready to accept the challenge without hesitating for a second, because she had nothing left to lose, and she was ready to go to the end. The young man responded with a denial, grinning, and defiantly noted that in such a situation, most likely, the lady would have to take care of her own defense, since it was unlikely that he was going to take part in such a fight without a reason, obvious motivation, and a specific threat to himself. Clutching the blade in his hand, Heimdall calmly explained that the beauty was completely defenseless before him, and if he had had even the slightest bad intentions, then, without a doubt, she would have been dead long ago, without even having time to understand what had happened. The girl smiled evilly, and with a playful challenge, ordered him to show how weak he thought she was, clutching the shining crystal in her hand, ready to fight at any turn of events, because she was ready to fight, even if it turned out to be her last fight in this life. Young Heimdall responded with a cruel smile, his scarlet eyes blazing with menace. He was ready to attack and acted with cold determination, leaving no room for doubt in his intentions, as if he knew that victory was inevitable and was about to be within his grasp. The young pair clashed in a fierce battle, with the maiden, shrouded in the blue glow of magic, attacking swiftly, while her opponent, possessing violet power concentrated in his blade, responded with equally powerful blows, as if the darkness itself was guiding his movements. The stone trembled under the onslaught of the blade, its surface immediately becoming covered with a network of deep cracks, as if magic itself could not hold it whole. And now it vibrated in the air, emitting a drawn-out hum, as if resisting the inevitable destruction, trying to cling to its integrity. A deafening crash echoed around the area as the decoration suddenly shattered into thousands of dazzlingly sparkling fragments that, like myriads of shining stars, began to swirl in the air, shimmering with magical reflections and showering the ground with a mesmerizing shining rain. With a wild grin, Heimdall pointed his blade towards the beauty, shouting that her magic was worthless before the raw power of his strength, and that she had no chance to defeat him, no matter what sorcery she tried to use, because her fate was already sealed. The girl began to cast a spell, deftly moving her fingers, and with a cold smile reminded the guy that earlier he himself had sworn not to touch her. Otherwise, there would be terrible consequences for breaking the promise, because the oath had been given, and every violator would definitely receive his deserved punishment. The beauty concentrated her inner energy, skillfully conjuring magical chains that suddenly flared with a blinding light, enveloping the space in a shimmering radiance, ready to bind the nobleman and irrevocably deprive him of freedom, because such a punishment was the only worthy one. The man froze, in shock, blade in hand, as magical chains suddenly wrapped around his body, restricting his movements, entangling his arms and legs with strong links, leaving no chance for escape, squeezing tighter and tighter, like steel snakes eager to strangle their victim. His feet were shackled with chains that were tightening ever tighter, digging into his flesh, preventing him from even moving, their cold metal chilling his skin unpleasantly, shackling every muscle, turning the struggle into a futile waste of energy, as if fate itself had decided to bring him to his knees. And so, with a deafening roar, Heimdall fell to the ground, unable to even move, his teeth clenched with tension, and his frowning gaze, full of rage and uncontrollable malice, betrayed all the hidden hatred that raged in his soul. Ready to break out, Syrinx stood over her fallen foe, looking down at him with cold superiority, and with a slight smirk declared that they had no time for a more severe punishment, no matter how just, for their paths were diverging, and this battle was pointless. Slowly, with a thoughtful expression on her face, she began to dispel the magic chains, believing that the man would no longer dare to attack her, because he had seen her strength with his own eyes, and realized how much he had underestimated her capabilities, making his fatal mistake. The lady walked away confidently, without turning around, but suddenly Heimdall's voice was heard behind her, who, rising with difficulty, shouted after her that, despite everything that had happened, they were too similar to each other, even if they did not want to admit it.